Chapter 1. The fresh mound of earth stood stark against the withering October grass, the only marker a simple wooden cross bearing the name Samuel Mason, born in 1825 and died in 1883. Most of the sparse gathering had already departed, their obligation to propriety fulfilled with minimal time spent. The final shovelful of dirt had barely settled before Mrs. Henderson had herded her daughters away, muttering, "Got to get before we catch consumption from standing too near a rag-picker's grave." Only Cora Mason remained, her slender figure motionless beside her father's grave, the chill wind tugging wisps of auburn hair from her practical bun. The hollow ache beneath her breastbone felt like hunger, though she'd had no appetite since Pa's breathing had rattled to a stop 3 days ago. Her calloused hands, capable of sorting a day's collection in half the time it took most men, now hung uselessly at her sides. She was aware of 2 figures lingering at a respectful distance, Pastor Thomas Wilson and his wife Sarah. Cora had seen genuine sorrow rather than pity or contempt in their eyes, but they had long been family friends. The cemetery occupied a gentle rise with a view of Oak Ridge below, smoke rising from chimneys against the backdrop of hills ablaze with autumn color. A train whistle sounded in the distance, the noon eastbound to Kansas City. Cora's gaze fell to her father's weathered cart at the bottom of the hill, the dappled mare patiently waiting, the sight of it, loaded with the day's collection of rags, metal, and salvaged bones, made her chest ache with the realization. "I'm alone now," she thought. The familiar smell of coal smoke drifted up from town, mingling with the earthy scent of fresh-turned soil. "Cora," Pastor Thomas's voice was gentle as he and Sarah finally approached. He was a sturdy man with kind eyes and a slight limp from an old farming accident. At 50, his sandy hair was heavily streaked with gray, and his plain black coat bore the slightest dusting of dandelion fluff, as if he'd stopped to comfort someone in a meadow on his way to the service. "We're mighty sorry about your father," he said, removing his hat. "Samuel was a good man." "Much obliged, Pastor." Cora's voice came out steadier than she expected. "Pa would have appreciated you saying the proper words over him. He always said you were one of the few who saw past the cart to the man pushing it." Sarah Wilson stepped closer, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Will you come to supper with us tonight, dear? You shouldn't be alone. Not today." Cora's fingers found the small silver cross at her throat, her mother's, the only piece of jewelry she owned. The metal was warm against her skin, worn smooth from years of the same unconscious gesture whenever she felt adrift. "That's kind, but there's work waiting. The cart's full, and those bones need sorting before morning." She glanced toward town. "McAllister pays premium for clean bones on Thursdays. Pa was particular about never missing a Thursday." The pastor and his wife exchanged a glance laden with concern. "Cora," Sarah began carefully, "there's room in our spare bedroom if you—" "I've got the cabin," Cora interrupted, her tone remaining respectful but firm. "Pa left it free and clear." Pastor Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "No one doubts your capability, Cora, but a young woman alone." He hesitated, the creak of his leather boots on the shifting dirt matching the groan of the old oak branches overhead. "There are other trades that might be more—" "Suitable?" Cora supplied, a hint of her father's directness showing through. "Begging your pardon, Pastor, but Pa taught me the trade proper. Started me sorting when I was just a girl, right after Ma took sick. I can tell good copper from bad just by the feel, and there's not a rag dealer in 3 counties who dare try to cheat Samuel Mason's daughter." She straightened, her worn boots firmly planted beside her father's grave. "I remember when the old general store burned in '76. It was Pa who salvaged enough metal to help them rebuild. Most folks have short memories when it comes to a man's worth. Pastor Thomas's eyes softened. The Lord is close to the broken-hearted, Cora. She turned her gaze back to the cart waiting below. That cart fed us 15 years since Ma passed. I don't aim to abandon it now. Sarah reached out, briefly touching Cora's arm. At least come by for Sunday dinner after service. Promise me that. Cora nodded, the gesture enough to satisfy the older woman. As they finally moved away, leaving her truly alone with her father's grave, Cora found herself whispering words her father had repeated countless times during their rounds through town. Everything has value to someone. She didn't know if she was referring to the items in the cart below or to herself. The last shovelful of dirt on the grave seemed to echo the finality of her situation. Cora Mason was now the only rag and bone collector in Oak Ridge. She absently traced the rough-hewn cross with her fingertips. "I'll make do, Pa," she whispered, "just like you taught me." Chapter 2. A week had passed since Samuel Mason was laid to rest, and Oak Ridge had shed what little tolerance it had shown for the rag and bone trade. Cora pulled her father's cart along Main Street, the wooden wheels rumbling against the uneven ground. She could feel the weight of stairs pressing against her back, heavier than any load the cart had ever carried. "Rags and bones, any rags or bones today?" The familiar cry caught in her throat, sounding thin and vulnerable compared to her father's resonant call. The November air carried the tang of wood smoke and approaching rain, along with the less pleasant odors of the blacksmith's forge and the butcher's waste bin as she passed. Cora had spent 3 evenings altering her father's collection apron to fit her smaller frame, shortening the leather straps worn smooth from years of use. The pockets bulged with the tools of her trade, small brass scales for weighing metals, a notebook bound in oilcloth for tracking transactions, a folding knife for cutting larger textiles, and a pouch of pennies and nickels for small payments. A brisk wind caught the edge of her faded blue work dress as she maneuvered the cart through a puddle left from yesterday's shower. The cart itself had required attention, too. She'd replaced rotting wood along the side panels and greased the axles, though the left wheel still wobbled ominously when fully loaded. Outside Henderson's general store, Sarah Wilson appeared in the doorway, her round face kind beneath her practical calico bonnet. "Morning, Cora," she called, clutching a bundle wrapped in brown paper along with her shopping basket. "Wait a shake. Got some worn linens might fetch you a fair price." Cora nodded gratefully, pulling the cart to a stop. "Much obliged, Mrs. Wilson." She knew the pastor's wife likely had little genuine need of her services. The bundle of clean, nearly serviceable cloth could have easily been repurposed in the Wilson household, but Cora accepted the offering with dignity, unwrapping it to inspect the contents before weighing them on her small brass scales. "That's 15 cents worth by my reckoning," Cora said, reaching for the coin purse in her apron pocket. "Nonsense," Sarah Wilson returned, waving away Cora's calculations. "I can't take more than 5 cents for such old things. And here," she pressed a small package into Cora's hands along with the linens. "There's a bit of cornbread wrapped in the middle, still warm from the oven." "Mrs. Wilson, I can't—" "You most certainly can," Sarah interrupted firmly. "Your father did Pastor Thomas a kindness once that we've never forgotten. This isn't charity, Cora Mason. It's a settling of accounts." Before Cora could protest further, the older woman accepted just a single nickel from Cora's palm and retreated into the store, leaving Cora momentarily warmed by the small kindness. She tucked the wrapped cornbread into her pocket, her stomach reminding her she'd left home at dawn with nothing but a cup of weak tea. The warmth dissipated quickly as she continued down Main Street. Outside Melba's Millinery, Mrs. Henderson and her eldest daughter turned their backs ostentatiously as Cora approached, their elaborate bustles and silk-trimmed hats a stark contrast to Cora's simple work dress and scuffed boots. "Land's sakes, I can't understand why Pastor Thomas allows her in the church at all." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried clearly, though she spoke as if Cora were invisible. "Samuel Mason was bad enough, but a woman in such a trade, it ain't decent nohow." "Absolutely scandalous," agreed her daughter Annabel, adjusting her lace gloves. "Father says she'll be begging at our doors come Christmas." "Or worse," Mrs. Henderson added, with meaningful emphasis. Cora kept her spine straight, her eyes forward as she passed them. Her father had taught her long ago that dignity couldn't be taken, only surrendered. In her mind, she recited the verse from James that Pastor Thomas had shared during one of his visits. "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial." Near the first bank of Oak Ridge, Mr. Holloway emerged from his mercantile, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him as one of the town's wealthiest citizens. Cora had always found something unsettling in his too smooth smile and calculating green eyes. "Well, well," he said, deliberately blocking her path on the narrow boardwalk, "Samuel Mason's daughter, carrying on the family business." His gaze moved over her with a familiarity that made her skin crawl beneath her worn shawl. "A young woman like yourself shouldn't be pushing a cart through town. I might have a more suitable position available at my establishment." His voice lowered. "Money to see you through hardship. A safe bed to get you through winter." Cora tightened her grip on the cart handles. "I'm doing well enough by my own hands, Mr. Holloway, but I thank you kindly for your concern." There was no true thankfulness in her tone, just as there was no true propriety in his. His smile thinned. "Pride goeth before destruction, Miss Mason, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Remember that when the snows come." She pushed past him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her father had warned her about men like Victor Holloway. Wolves dressed in fine wool, he'd called them, with teeth just waiting for the weakest lamb. She shook her head as she continued forward. Did he truly not see what a fool he was, spewing scriptures as if he had the right? Was he fool enough to think his proposition was appealing? As she approached Gunderson's blacksmith, the sound of the hammer striking anvil ceased as three men lounged against the wall, passing a flask between them. Cora recognized them as the Tanner brothers and Will Simmons, day laborers who frequented the Oak Barrel Saloon when they had coin to spare. "Here comes the bone picker," called the youngest Tanner, his voice carrying across the street. "Hey, girlie, found any corpses today?" "Heard tell she digs 'em up when nobody's looking," added his brother with a guffaw. "That's how she gets them bones so clean." Will Simmons spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed deliberately close to her boot. "Ain't natural, a woman doing such work." Cora kept her eyes forward, but her knuckles whitened on the cart handles. Her father had endured such comments with a smile and a clever retort. "Let them talk, Cora girl," he'd say. "A man's words tell you more about him than they ever will about you." She found she lacked his easy way with words when faced with cruelty. The cart hit a deep rut where Main Street met Oak Avenue, and Cora felt a sickening lurch as the left wheel struck a large stone hidden in the mud. The crack of splitting wood echoed loudly, and before she could brace herself, the wheel collapsed entirely. The cart tilted sharply, spilling her morning's collection across the muddy street. Meticulously sorted rags, bottles, bones, and metal pieces, scattering in all directions. Laughter erupted from the men, joined quickly by a butcher's boy and two women leaving the post office. "Looks like the rag picker's daughter is losing her grip," called the elder Tanner brother, making no move to help. Cora knelt in the street, gathering the scattered items with methodical movements, though her hands trembled slightly. Cotton rags in one pile, wool in another, metals sorted by type, the organization her father had drilled into her since childhood, becoming her armor against humiliation. A small crowd had gathered to watch, their amusement barely disguised as concern. "Shameful business for a woman," Cora heard Mrs. Miller say to her companion. "Her poor mother would turn in her grave if she could see." Cora's fingers closed around a brass candlestick, still good despite its dented base. One of the prongs had broken off, but the metal itself was quality work, worth at least 30 cents to the right buyer. She remembered her father's voice. "People throw away what they don't value, Cora girl, but that don't mean it's worthless." She tucked it carefully into the apron pocket. The rain that had threatened all morning began to fall, gentle at first, then heavier. The spectators dispersed quickly, seeking shelter, their entertainment concluded. Only then did Cora allow herself to blink rapidly against the hot pressure behind her eyes. "Need a hand there, miss?" A man's voice, unfamiliar but not unkind, made her look up. Through the rain she could see a tall figure standing at the doorway of the carpentry shop. The sign above read simply, "Burke Woodworking," in clean, freshly painted letters. Ephraim Burke. She recognized him, knew her father had counted him as a friend. She had never spoken with him herself, but they'd exchanged polite nods every now and again. He stood watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. He was broad-shouldered, with the solid build of someone accustomed to physical labor, his dark hair showing touches of silver at the temples despite appearing not much past 30. Unlike the others, his blue eyes held no mockery. Cora straightened, pushing wet strands of hair from her face. "I can manage." "No doubt," he replied, his voice low and even. "But that wheel needs more than managing. It needs replacing." He stepped out into the rain, seemingly unconcerned about his rolled shirt sleeves getting wet. The way he assessed the damage was professional, not pitying. "I've pine stock that would serve," he said, gesturing toward his shop. "Wouldn't take above an hour to fashion a new one." Cora's pride warred with practicality. Without a functioning wheel, she couldn't move the cart. Without the cart, she couldn't work. Without work, she couldn't eat. "I've no money to spare for such repairs," she admitted, the words bitter on her tongue. A fleeting gentleness came into his eyes, gone before it fully settled in. "Didn't ask for any." He glanced at her collection of salvaged items. "Though if you've any brass fittings in that lot, I could use some for cabinet handles." It was an offer that preserved her dignity, trade rather than charity. Cora found herself nodding once, sharply. "I have several that might suit," she said, reaching for the candlestick in her pocket. As she pulled it out, she noticed something she'd missed before, a small etching on the base, partially obscured by tarnish. She recognized it instantly as the maker's mark of a Boston foundry, which would triple its value to the right buyer. Her father had taught her to look for such details, his keen eye for quality having saved them from hunger more than once during lean times. "I've better pieces for trade," she said, returning the candlestick to her pocket and selecting a different item, a set of hinges still in good condition. These would serve cabinet work better. Respect flickered in the carpenter's eyes as he accepted the hinges, examining them with a craftsman's attention before nodding. Cora felt herself relax. This man was nothing like Holloway, or the men who heckled her, or the gossips who dogged her every step. He knew the value of the candlestick, of her decision. He was more like the Wilsons, like her father had been before he died. No wonder he had counted this man his friend. His voice pulled her back from her reflections. "Fair trade," he said simply. "Name's Ephraim Burke." "Cora Mason." "I know. He held her gaze for a long moment before turning toward his shop. "You should come in out of the rain." As he walked toward the building, Cora gathered the last of her scattered collection, her movements more purposeful now. The weight of grief and scorn still pressed down upon her shoulders. But maybe there was one more person she might call a friend. She felt tears prick at her eyes but blinked them away, taking a slow, steady breath. She would not cry, not here, not where anyone could see. Cora Mason was her father's daughter, and Samuel Mason hadn't raised her to bend beneath the weight of contempt. The rain washed mud from her hands as she followed Ephraim, and she told herself the moisture on her cheeks was nothing more than heaven's tears, not her own. Chapter 3. Ephraim Burke stood at the window of his carpentry shop, a half-finished chair rail forgotten in his hands, as he watched the scene unfolding across the muddy street. The steady rhythm of rain on the tin roof overhead matched the pounding in his chest as he witnessed the Tanner brothers' cruel laughter. Through the wavy glass panes distorted by years and imperfect craftsmanship, he could see Cora Mason kneeling in the mud, gathering her scattered goods with methodical determination. The familiar anger rose in his throat. 7 years he'd been in Oak Ridge, 7 years of proving himself different from the man who'd stepped off that westbound train with shaking hands and a letter to his grandmother clutched in his pocket. He'd become a different man in those years. Most of the town had stayed the same. A gust of wind rattled the shop door, carrying with it the rich scents of his trade. Fresh-cut pine stacked against the eastern wall, the sweet, sharp tang of cherry waiting to become a rocking chair for Dr. Franklin's wife, linseed oil warming in its pot on the small pot-bellied stove. The tools of his craft hung in precise rows along the western wall, each implement suspended from pegs he'd carved himself during those first sleepless nights when the craving for cards and whiskey had nearly driven him back to the train station. "Order creates peace," his grandmother had told him, standing in this very spot when the shop had been nothing but an abandoned livery stable with a leaking roof. The hands need purpose to stay out of trouble. Margaret Burke had understood what he needed when he'd arrived on her doorstep, hollow-eyed and shivering with more than just the February cold. She'd offered neither easy forgiveness nor cold rejection, but instead a chance to rebuild with the same measured patience she'd shown in teaching him to read as a boy before his father had dragged him away on his chase for fortune. They'd found devastation instead. A sharp crack from outside pulled him from his thoughts. Through the rain-streaked window he saw Cora's small figure struggling to right the tilted cart, its broken wheel now completely separated from the axle. Not a single person moved to help. Ephraim set the chair rail down on his workbench, carefully aligned with the edge, a habit born of his grandmother's insistence on orderliness as the foundation of reformation. The rhythmic ticking of the walnut pendulum clock he'd built last winter measured out the seconds of his hesitation. 7 years of careful reputation building had earned him, if not acceptance, at least a grudging respect from Oak Ridge. The memory of his earliest days here stung still, the whispers following him into church, the mothers pulling children aside when he passed, the merchants who'd mysteriously run out of whatever he'd come to purchase. Only Samuel Mason had treated him no differently than anyone else, offering the same gruff courtesy he showed to all. Ephraim had never mentioned it, but he'd noticed how the older man had discreetly collected the whiskey bottles Ephraim had hidden behind his shop during those first tortured months of sobriety. Mason had simply added them to his cart without comment, taking away the evidence of weakness without judgment. His father's face rose in his memory, not the final image of William Burke slumped over a saloon table, dead from heart failure with cards still clutched in his hand, but earlier, teaching a 10-year-old Ephraim how to plane wood smooth with long, even strokes, before the gambling had consumed him, before he'd sold his tools for poker stakes. "You've the touch for fine work," his father had said, pride warming his voice. "Remember that when the world tells you otherwise." The world had told Ephraim Burke many things in the years since, that he was weak, worthless, beyond redemption. He heard echoes of those same condemnations in the whispers now surrounding Cora Mason as she knelt in the mud. Almost without conscious decision, Ephraim found himself at the shop door, the brass bell overhead jangling sharply as he stepped onto the covered porch. He called out across the rain-slicked street, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet that had fallen as the spectators dispersed. "Need a hand there, miss?" She looked up, rain streaming down her face, expression guarded. He could see the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her brown eyes, the pride that kept her spine straight despite her kneeling position in the mud. And he saw the tears there just behind the exhaustion, too stubborn, too strong to let them fall, maybe just too alone to let them begin. "Bring your cart across," he called a short while later, gesturing to his shop. "You should come in out of the rain." "You needn't have troubled yourself, Mr. Burke," she said as she joined him near his shop. "No trouble," he replied, looking back at her. "My grandmother would have my hide if I let anyone struggle in this weather when I've a roof to offer." Her expression softened at the mention of his grandmother. Margaret Burke was one of the few in town who had shown Samuel Mason any real respect. She'd have shown the same kindness to his daughter, Ephraim knew. "Been meaning to fashion a new wheel for some time," he said, as he moved to help maneuver the cart. It wasn't entirely true, but it eased the moment. "It served Pa well enough," she replied. Her tone held more loyalty than defensiveness. "Your father could coax life from things others thought long dead," Ephraim agreed, examining the broken wheel more closely. "Could spot value where most never thought to look." The tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. "You knew him well." "He knew me," Ephraim corrected, meeting her eyes briefly before returning his attention to the wheel, when that was something few in Oak Ridge were inclined to do. He didn't elaborate further, instead gesturing toward his shop door. "Best get inside before you catch your death. I've coffee on the stove that might help chase the chill." Inside, the shop was warm from the small, pot-bellied stove, a sharp contrast to the biting cold of the November rain. The rich scent of coffee mingled with wood oils and fresh shavings, creating the distinctive perfume. Cora stood just inside the doorway, water pooling beneath her sodden boots, her gaze traveling over the ordered workshop. Ephraim was suddenly aware of how the space might appear to a visitor, the half-finished pieces arranged by stage of completion, the carefully labeled drawers containing different sizes of nails and screws, the wooden templates hanging on the north wall, the small desk in the corner where he kept his accounts. "You've done well for yourself," she observed, no envy in her voice, merely a statement of fact. "Been fortunate," he replied, moving to the stove to pour coffee into 2 chipped enamel mugs. "Had help when I needed it most." He handed her a mug, noticing how she cradled it in both hands for warmth before taking a careful sip. "Your grandmother," Cora said, gaze settling on a small framed photograph on his desk. "Margaret Burke. She once bought a rag rug from Pa for twice its worth, then told the Ladies' Aid Society it had come from St. Louis when they admired it." The unexpected memory startled a low chuckle from Ephraim. "Sounds like her. Woman's got more steel in her spine than most men I've known." Cora's eyes met his over the rim of her coffee mug, a shared understanding passing between them. "About that wheel," Ephraim said, setting his mug down and turning toward his stock of seasoned wood. "I've oak that would serve better than pine if you don't mind waiting a touch longer for it." "I've little enough money to pay for pine, let alone oak," she replied, the words matter-of-fact rather than self-pitying. Ephraim reached for the brass hinges she'd offered earlier, examining them with exaggerated care. "These more than cover it," he said. "Good brass is hard to come by these days." It wasn't precisely true. Victor Holloway's mercantile carried perfectly adequate hardware. He watched her pause to absorb the small deception as her eyes met his own, as if to take his measure, before giving a gracious nod. "Best get to work before the rain stops, and half the town needs something repaired," he said, turning to select his tools from their places on the wall. Each implement was a testament to his reformation: the draw knife purchased with his first honest wages, the set of chisels saved for over 6 months, the planes carefully restored from his grandfather's weathered collection. Cora stepped deeper into the shop, her gaze traveling over a nearly completed dresser, standing against the far wall. Her fingers, calloused in different places than his own, traced the dovetail joints with a craftsman's appreciation. "Fine work," she said simply. "My father taught me," Ephraim replied, surprising himself with the admission. He rarely spoke of William Burke to anyone. "The wheels should be ready by mid-afternoon," Ephraim continued, measuring the broken original to ensure the replacement would fit properly. "You're welcome to wait if you've a mind to, or return later." "I'd as soon wait if it's no trouble," she replied. "The rains like to continue, and I've other collections to make once the cart's mended." Ephraim nodded, oddly pleased by her decision. As he selected a piece of oak and began to work, the familiar rhythm of creation settled over him. The draw of the saw, the careful touch of the chisel, the smooth sweep of the plane, each movement a reminder that broken things could be remade, that what seemed beyond repair might yet find new purpose. From the corner of his eye, he watched Cora Mason examine his workshop with quiet attention, her expression thoughtful as she sipped her coffee. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Oak Ridge, washing mud from the streets in small rivers that carried away the day's debris. Chapter 4. Ephraim pushed open the door to his grandmother's modest home on Church Street, the familiar creak of the hinges announcing his arrival as he shook rainwater from his coat and hung it on the carved oak peg by the entrance. "Grandmother, I'm home." The house carried the lingering aroma of beef stew and fresh bread, Sarah Wilson's doing, no doubt. The pastor's wife had taken to bringing meals 3 times a week, though Margaret insisted she needed no such charity. A bouquet of late autumn chrysanthemums brightened the entryway table, their scent mingling with beeswax polish. "In here, Ephraim." Her voice came from the small parlor where afternoon light was best for her needlework. He found her seated in the wingback chair that had belonged to his grandfather, Judge Frederick Burke, whose stern portrait hung above the Riverstone fireplace. Even in her decline, Margaret Burke maintained the dignity that had seen her through the scandals of her son's gambling and her grandson's redemption. Her white hair was neatly pinned in its customary style, and her blue eyes, the same shade as Ephraim's own, remained sharp despite the years etched around them. A well-worn Bible lay open on the small table beside her, its pages marked with a faded ribbon bookmark. The hymnal from First Presbyterian sat beside it, several pages dog-eared from frequent reference. "You're late today," she observed, setting aside the quilt square she'd been stitching. Her fingers moved stiffly as she placed the needle in its case, with a small wince she tried to hide. "Sarah brought stew. It's keeping warm." Ephraim crossed to the fireplace, adding another log, though the day wasn't particularly cold. The familiar routine gave him a moment to gather his thoughts. to find words that wouldn't betray his worry at the increased pallor of her complexion. "Had a wheel to mend," he explained, arranging kindling around the log. "Samuel Mason's daughter brought his cart by." A touch of sadness flickered in Margaret's eyes. She reached for her handkerchief, dabbing at her lips before speaking. "Cora, how is she managing?" Ephraim straightened from the fireplace, brushing wood chips from his hands. "With more backbone than most men I know." He paused, studying his grandmother. "You knew her family well." Margaret folded her hands in her lap to disguise their trembling. "Known Cora since she was born. Mary Mason, her mother, helped deliver you, you know." She shifted in her chair, her breath catching slightly before she continued. "Samuel would bring Mary along on his collection rounds before Cora was born. Practical woman Mary was. Made the finest quilts from salvaged cloth you ever saw." The mantel clock ticked steadily in the silence that followed. Rain continued to fall, pattering against the leaded glass panes in a gentle rhythm. A draft whistled through the parlor. Ephraim crossed to her side, adjusting the small footstool beneath her feet without comment. They had developed an unspoken agreement over the years. He would assist without making her ask, and she would accept without acknowledging the need. "How bad is the pain today?" he asked quietly, noting how she pressed her hand against her side when she thought he wasn't looking. "Nothing a woman of 78 hasn't earned the right to carry," Margaret replied. A hint of mischief sparked in her eyes. Her small attempt at humor did not disguise the wheeze in her breathing. Ephraim poured her a glass of water from the pitcher on the side table, placing it within easy reach. "The Mason girl, she's continuing the trade?" Margaret inquired, accepting the water with a grateful nod. Ephraim settled into the chair opposite hers. "Seems determined to, despite the town's opinion. Broke her wheel today, and half of Main Street stood watching while she gathered her goods from the mud." "And you?" "I fixed her wheel." Margaret's lips curved in a knowing smile. "Your grandfather would have done the same. He always said actions reveal character more than words." She paused to catch her breath. "Oakridge has never lacked for opinions," she added. "Only for kindness in expressing them. I remember when your grandfather ruled on the Patterson land dispute. Half the town didn't speak to us for a month. The ones who did were the ones who'd lost." The fire crackled and spat as a pocket of sap ignited. Outside, the church bell chimed the quarter hour. Ephraim rose to light the oil lamp as shadows lengthened across the room, its warm glow softening the faded wallpaper's pattern of climbing roses. "Samuel was one of the few who treated me decent when I first came back," Ephraim said, memories of those early, desperate days surfacing unbidden. "Never said much, but he'd nod when we passed on the street. Collected those bottles I tried to hide behind the shop, too." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "He mentioned that to me. Said everyone deserves a second chance to prove their measure. Said the Lord's grace meant nothing if we couldn't extend it to one another." She fingered the worn edge of her Bible. Samuel Mason was a fair man, knew the worth of things other folks discarded. She paused, her breathing slightly labored. "Including people." The silence stretched between them again, comfortable yet laden with unspoken worries. His grandmother's health had been declining gradually over the past year, but the past month had seen a more rapid change. More difficulty breathing, less appetite, increasing pain that the willow bark tea no longer seemed to ease. "Dr. Franklin looked in yesterday," she said finally, answering his unasked question. "Says it's my heart. Says I should consider moving into town proper, where help is closer." Ephraim felt his chest tighten. The small house on the edge of Church Street had been her home for over 40 years. It was where she'd raised his father, where she'd welcomed Ephraim back, despite the scandal that had followed him, where she'd patiently rebuilt his faith in humanity and in himself through daily prayers and unwavering belief in second chances. We could hire someone, he offered, knowing even as he spoke that their finances wouldn't stretch to a full-time nurse, not with the business still establishing itself and the loans for the equipment not yet fully paid. Margaret Burke had never been one to waste words on unnecessary objections. Instead, she fixed her clear blue gaze on her grandson. "I'm not leaving my home, Ephraim, not while there's breath in my body." She reached for her cane, propped against the side table. "Help me to the kitchen. I want to make sure Sarah hasn't reorganized my spice shelf again," in her well-meaning way. Ephraim rose immediately, offering his arm with practiced care. Her weight against him was alarmingly light, as if the substance of her was slowly diminishing despite her iron will. They moved slowly through the narrow hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath their steps. In the kitchen, the stew bubbled gently on the back of the cast-iron stove, filling the air with the aroma of beef and carrots. The steady ticking of the clock on the wall punctuated their movements as Ephraim settled his grandmother at the oak table before retrieving bowls from the Welsh dresser that had been her mother's. Dried herbs hung in neat bundles from the ceiling beams, Margaret's doing from healthier days. "You've had that look since you walked in," Margaret observed as he placed a bowl before her. Her fingers traced the blue willow pattern absently. "The one your father wore when the cards weren't falling his way. What's troubling you beyond my health?" Ephraim served the stew, buying time before answering. His grandmother had always been able to read him too well. The spoon rattled slightly against the bowl as he set it down. "Been thinking about the future," he admitted finally, taking his seat across from her. "The future belongs to the Lord," she replied, bowing her head briefly in a silent grace before continuing. "Our task is to meet it with faith and preparation, not fear." "I can't care for you properly while running the shop," he said, voicing the concern that had been growing as her health declined. "And I won't see you in someone else's care." Margaret's expression softened. "My care isn't your burden alone, Ephraim. Who else is there?" The question emerged more sharply than he'd intended. They both knew the answer. His father dead, his mother remarried and moved to California that same year, no siblings or cousins to share the responsibility. Margaret took a small spoonful of stew, considering. "The Lord provides in unexpected ways if we're wise enough to recognize His hand." She gestured toward the window where the church spire was just visible through the rain. "I was just Cora's age when I found myself alone after my father died. No prospects, no family to speak of." She sipped water to ease a sudden bout of coughing. When she continued, her voice was softer, tinged with memory. "Your grandfather was newly appointed to the bench, needed a respectable household to match his position." A faint smile touched her lips. "In those days, that required a wife, preferably one who could manage accounts and social obligations." Ephraim looked up. This was a story he'd never heard, despite the years he'd lived under her roof. "It was a practical arrangement at first," she continued, breaking a piece of bread with trembling fingers. "We barely knew each other, but we each had something the other needed." "You never loved him?" Ephraim asked, unable to imagine his stern grandfather and formidable grandmother as anything but the pillars of propriety he'd known as a child. A soft laugh escaped her, followed by a concerning wheeze. "Love grew as it tends to do when properly tended, like any garden worth having." Her eyes held his, unwavering despite the pain he could see behind them. A household needs both a man's strength and a woman's wisdom, particularly when difficulties arise. She paused, studying him with the same penetrating gaze that had intimidated generations of schoolchildren. "You've made a fine life here, Ephraim. A respectable trade, a home, a place in the community. But a man alone faces certain limitations." The back of Ephraim's neck warmed. "If you're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing," she interrupted with a wave of her hand, simply observing that life offers crossroads where practical considerations and providence often align. Her gaze drifted to the window where the rain had slackened to a gentle mist. "I watched the Mason girl last Sunday at church, sitting alone in that back pew, chin up despite the whispers. Reminds me of myself at her age, too proud to admit the world's a harsh place for a woman alone, too stubborn to accept help that smells of charity." Ephraim stared into his stew, the image of Cora Mason rising unbidden in his mind, her quiet dignity as she knelt in the mud gathering her spilled goods, the intelligence in her eyes as she examined his carpentry work, the gentle way she'd spoken of his grandmother. "The good Lord doesn't just provide," Margaret added softly. "Sometimes he expects us to be the provision for others." Before Ephraim could respond, a spasm of coughing seized her, violent enough to shake her slight frame. He was on his feet instantly, supporting her shoulders until the fit passed. "It's nothing," she said, her voice raspy. "Bit of stew went down wrong." They both knew it was a lie, but Ephraim only nodded. He helped her back to her chair in the parlor, making sure the quilt was tucked around her legs before rekindling the fire. The Bible on the side table still open to the Book of Ruth, the story that had been Margaret's favorite since childhood. "You should rest," he said, unable to keep the worry from his voice. "I'll rest soon enough, Ephraim. The good Lord will call when he's ready." She settled back in the chair, her eyes already drooping despite her declaration. "Just promise me you'll pray on what I've said, about provision and needs meeting in the Lord's timing." "I will," he promised, knowing she meant far more than she had said aloud. Ephraim stood by the fireplace, watching as his grandmother's breathing gradually evened into sleep. The firelight softened the lines of her face, making her appear almost young, the woman from the daguerreotype on the mantel, from the same year she'd taught him to read as a boy. Outside, the church bell rang 5 times, marking the hour. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving puddles that reflected the emerging evening stars. Tomorrow would bring Sunday service, where he would sit in the middle pews, as he had for 7 years, accepted but not embraced by the congregation that had once witnessed his grandfather's prominence. And somewhere across town, Cora Mason would be preparing for the same service, alone in the cabin where her father had died. Ephraim's gaze fell on his grandmother's Bible, still open. Beside it lay her cane, carved by his own hands from oak, the handle worn smooth from daily use. He had made it to support her when he could not be present. Now he wondered what other support might be needed. He'd been spending more nights sleeping here, watching over grandmother, than in his home over the shop. Maybe it was time to make the stay more permanent. The idea forming in his mind felt both troubling and inevitable, like the moment before a saw first bites into fine wood. All possibilities contained in that instant before the first cut commits the craftsman to a single path. Slowly, the thought solidified. Maybe someone else should be moving in as well. Chapter 5. Cora waited at the scarred wooden counter at McAllister's Metal Works, shoulders straight despite her fatigue, as Tobias McAllister examined the brass candlestick and collection of copper fittings she'd laid before him. The shop smelled of metal filings, coal smoke, and the sour tang of the pickling solution used to clean tarnished pieces. Outside, the steady rhythm of Gunderson's hammer on anvil punctuated the mid-morning quiet. The small silver cross at Cora's throat felt heavier today. She'd been to 3 establishments already, each offering less than the last for her carefully sorted collection. McAllister was her final hope before the half-day journey to Liberty would become necessary. "Ain't much here worth speaking of," McAllister muttered, pushing the candlestick aside with a tobacco-stained finger. "Brass is common as dirt these days. Might give you 15 cents for the lot." Cora knew better. The maker's mark on the candlestick alone made it worth twice what McAllister offered for everything. Her father had taught her well. She unconsciously sorted the copper fittings by size as she considered her response, a habit that had always amused her father. "The candlestick's Boston-made," she said evenly, careful to keep defensiveness from her tone. "Genuine brass, not plated. 25 cents for that piece alone would be fair." McAllister's gray eyebrows lifted, his thin lips twitching beneath his walrus mustache. Would have expected Samuel to teach his girl better manners than to question a businessman's judgment. "Pa taught me to know the value of things," Cora replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Her fingers found the cross at her throat, drawing strength from its familiar contours. "He also taught me that Wilkins down in Liberty pays 18 cents a pound for clean copper. No questions asked." The veiled threat of taking her business elsewhere caused a subtle shift in McAllister's demeanor. He snorted, picking up the candlestick again and turning it in the light with feigned nonchalance. "Shopkeepers can't be as generous as they once were," he said, examining the maker's mark as though seeing it for the first time. "Railroad rates keep climbing. Telegram came yesterday with news of another rate hike before Christmas." He adjusted his green eyeshade, a gesture Cora recognized as his prelude to compromise. "But seeing as your father was a regular customer—" He paused, calculating. 20 cents for the candlestick, another dime for the copper. That's fair enough. It wasn't fair, not by half, but Cora needed the money more than she needed to win the negotiation. Winter was approaching, and the cabin's roof required patching before the first heavy snow. Her small garden had yielded poorly after weeks of neglect during her father's final illness. The well pump needed a new leather gasket, and her last pair of wool stockings had developed a hole too large to mend. "I'll accept 30 cents for all," she said, forcing herself to sound grateful rather than defeated. How far 30 cents must stretch now, she thought, when Pa could earn that with a single morning's collection. As McAllister grudgingly counted coins from his cash box, the shop bell jangled. Cora sensed rather than saw the change in the shopkeeper's demeanor, a straightening of his stooped shoulders, a deferential adjustment to his expression. "Mr. Holloway, good day to you, sir. Be with you directly." Cora turned slightly to see Victor Holloway removing his expensive leather gloves, one finger at a time. His tailored wool coat and polished boots seemed to belong to a different world than the workingman's shop with its barrels of metal scraps and grimy tools. At 38, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with well-groomed blonde hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to deference. The gold watch chain across his waistcoat probably cost more than Cora earned in 3 months. "No rush, McAllister," Holloway replied, his green eyes fixing on Cora with a smile that didn't quite reach them. "Miss Mason and I attend the same church. Isn't that right, my dear?" The familiar address made Cora's skin prickle with discomfort. She'd seen Holloway at services, of course. Everyone had. He sat in the front pew each Sunday, his generous donations to the collection plate made conspicuous by the crisp new bills he placed there. Pastor Thomas treated him with the same kindness he showed all parishioners, but Cora had noted the subtle reservation in the pastor's manner when dealing with the wealthy merchant. Like someone handling a well-groomed snake, she thought, then immediately felt ashamed for the unchristian comparison. "Mr. Holloway," she acknowledged with a polite nod, gathering her coins from the counter and tucking them into the small purse hidden in her apron pocket. She was acutely aware of her worn dress and mud-spattered boots beneath his assessing gaze. "I understand you're continuing your father's profession," Holloway said, moving closer. His cologne, something expensive and faintly spiced, momentarily overpowered the metallic shop smell. "A most unusual choice for a young lady of your—" He paused, eyes flicking in a thorough, slow, and altogether indecent appraisal before he began again. "A young lady of your potential. I hope you've considered my previous offer." She stiffened, but did not speak. McAllister busied himself with reorganizing items on a shelf, clearly eager to avoid any appearance of listening while simultaneously missing nothing. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the sudden silence. "It's honest work," Cora replied finally, grateful that her voice remained steady. She began rewrapping her empty collection sack, signaling her intention to leave. "Oh, indeed," Holloway agreed with exaggerated sincerity, though one wonders if a woman alone can manage such physically demanding labor. He stepped slightly closer, blocking her path to the door without appearing to do so deliberately. "I've recently lost my housekeeper to matrimony. The position offers a private room, regular meals, and fair wages." "I'm managing well enough with my father's trade, Mr. Holloway," she said, reaching for the latch of the shop door. Her heart hammered in her chest, a mix of anger and unease. His hand shot out, not quite touching her arm, but hovering close enough that she could feel the heat of it through her sleeve. "Perhaps you misunderstand my offer, Miss Mason." His voice dropped lower, meant for her ears alone, though McAllister still pretended fascination with his shelf arrangement. "A woman in your situation might benefit from protection. Winter will be unbearable in that run-down shack your father left you." Cora had seen enough of the world in her 24 years to recognize a snare when it was laid before her. She'd heard whispers about the previous housekeeper who had left town suddenly after 6 months in Holloway's employ. The woman's swelling abdomen had not gone unnoticed by Oak Ridge's sharp-eyed matrons. "The Lord is my rock and my fortress," she quoted softly, the words of Psalm 18 rising to her lips unbidden. "I thank you for your concern, Mr. Holloway, but I require no protection beyond that." Something hardened in his expression, a momentary crack in the benevolent facade. Even the good book acknowledges practical realities. His smile returned, practiced and hollow. "My offer remains. Winter comes early to these hills, and a woman alone faces particular hardships. I've seen the sad shape of your roof." The casual mention of her home sent a chill through Cora that had nothing to do with the November air seeping through the shop's walls. How closely had he been watching her? The thought of his eyes on her little cabin, perhaps even on her as she worked in the garden, made her stomach clench. The bell above the door jangled again, saving Cora from having to formulate a response. Ephraim Burke stepped into the shop, a list in his hand and sawdust still clinging to his shirt sleeves. He nodded politely to all present, though his gaze lingered a moment longer on Cora. "McAllister, need those hinges we discussed," he said, his tone businesslike. "Finishing Mrs. Franklin's cabinet by week's end." "Of course, Mr. Burke," McAllister responded, relief at the interruption evident in his voice. "Got them set aside for you." Holloway's attention shifted to Ephraim, his posture subtly straightening as though preparing for confrontation. "Burke," he acknowledged with the barest nod. "Business must be prospering if you're serving the doctor's household. Quite a journey from your former enterprises." The deliberate reference to Ephraim's past hung in the air like smoke. Cora noticed how Ephraim's jaw tightened, though his voice remained even when he replied. "Honest work tends to find honest hands," he said, neither deferential nor challenging. Cora used the moment to step toward the door, but Holloway turned back to her with practiced smoothness. "Consider what I've said, Miss Mason. Pride makes a cold bedfellow when snow flies." Ephraim's eyes narrowed slightly at this, his gaze moving between Cora and Holloway with quiet assessment. Ephraim's eyes flickered, and Cora could feel instinctively that he was angrier on her behalf than he had been at his own slight by Holloway. She did not stop to wonder further. "Good day, Mr. McAllister, Mr. Holloway, Mr. Burke." Cora nodded to each in turn, grateful that years of hiding her emotions behind dignity allowed her to exit without betraying how badly her hands were shaking. Outside, the November air felt clean after the close atmosphere of the shop. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the building's rough wooden exterior for just a moment. Through the window she could see Holloway speaking intently to Ephraim, who stood with arms folded across his chest, his expression darkening with each word. Cora straightened her shoulders and began walking toward the general store. 30 cents wouldn't buy the roof patches she needed, but perhaps Sarah Wilson might have some salvage cloth for trade. The parsonage would be her next stop. One step at a time, she told herself. Her fingers closed around the coins in her pocket, each one representing hours of work collecting, sorting, and negotiating. How many more such transactions would it take before winter's arrival? Inside the shop, Ephraim listened with growing anger as Holloway's smooth voice continued its practiced performance. "Such a tragedy about Samuel Mason," Holloway was saying, adjusting his expensive waistcoat. "The daughter seems determined to follow his path, though a woman in such a trade." He shook his head with false concern. "I've offered her a position in my household, much more appropriate." Ephraim thought of Cora's straight spine and determined eyes, of the dignity she maintained despite everything Oak Ridge threw at her. "Miss Mason seems capable of making her own decisions," he said, accepting the package of hinges McAllister handed across the counter. Holloway's smile thinned. "Few women truly understand what's best for them, Burke." He leaned closer, lowering his voice, though McAllister could certainly still hear. "How is your grandmother's health these days?" "Still declining, I hear." There was casual cruelty in Holloway's words, but Ephraim didn't let anger rise to the surface. Didn't even bother to look at the other man, pausing to give a brief nod to McAllister as he turned to leave. "My grandmother is in God's hands, as are we all," he replied evenly. "If you'll excuse me, I have work waiting." As he left the shop, Ephraim caught sight of Cora's slender figure disappearing around the corner towards the general store. His gaze tracked her progress, noting the proud set of her shoulders despite everything. A protective urge stirred in his chest, a feeling unfamiliar yet somehow inevitable. "She deserves better than this town has given her," he thought, tucking the package of hinges into his pocket. The image of Holloway's predatory smile lingered unpleasantly in his mind. Men like that considered themselves entitled to whatever or whoever they desired. Watching Cora walk away, Ephraim felt a quiet resolve taking root alongside the tender concern that had been growing since he'd first helped her with the broken cart. His grandmother's words from the previous evening echoed in his thoughts. The Lord doesn't just provide. Sometimes he expects us to be the provision for others. Ephraim turned toward his workshop, mind still turning over the possibility that had lingered for days. Cora Mason's situation, his grandmother's need for a woman's care, two potential problems that together formed a perfect solution. The thought made his heart beat faster. He glanced back when the door to McAllister's shop opened again. Victor Holloway emerged, pausing to glance in the direction Cora had gone. The satisfied smile on his face had Ephraim clenching his fist. Practical arrangements had built many a solid marriage in Oak Ridge. It was time to propose such an arrangement himself. Chapter 6. 3 days after the incident at McAllister's, Cora guided her horse and cart down Oak Avenue. The wheel Ephraim Burke had repaired still held firm, turning steadily over the rutted street. November had tightened its grip on Oak Ridge, bringing with it a bitter wind that found every gap in her woolen shawl. The day's collection had been meager: a few copper fittings from the blacksmith's scrap heap, some cotton rags from Sarah Wilson, who always seemed to discover items needing disposal when Cora passed by, and a broken lantern that might yield good brass if properly dismantled. The small silver cross at her throat felt cold against her skin as she pulled the shawl tighter. The coins from McAllister hadn't stretched as far as she'd hoped. The roof still leaked in 3 places, and she'd been forced to place buckets beneath each drip during the previous night's rain. Her breath formed small clouds in the fading light as she passed the last buildings at the edge of town. Victor Holloway's words echoed uncomfortably in her memory. "Pride makes a cold bedfellow when snow flies." She shivered, and not entirely from the cold. "Miss Mason." The voice startled her from her troubled thoughts. Ephraim Burke stood at the corner where Oak Avenue met the dirt lane leading to her father's cabin. He wore a heavy wool coat with a muffler wrapped around his neck, a cloth cap pulled low against the cold. A canvas bag was slung over his shoulder, and he held what appeared to be a wooden box in his gloved hands. His breath came quickly, as though he'd hurried to intercept her before she reached home. "Mr. Burke," she acknowledged, pulling the cart to a halt. "If you've come to check your handiwork, the wheel's serving well enough." He nodded, his blue eyes serious beneath the cap brim. One hand moved to adjust his muffler, then dropped back to his side in an aborted gesture. Was he nervous? "Glad to hear it." He glanced at the darkening sky, then back to her face. "Thought you might allow me to walk alongside. These paths get treacherous after dark." Cora studied him for a moment. In the weeks since he'd helped repair her cart, she'd noticed him watching her with careful concern from the doorway of his shop when she passed. The attention had unsettled her at first, then gradually became a reassuring constant. "As you wish," she said finally, clicking her tongue to urge the old mare forward. "Though I know the way well enough." They walked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the creak of the cartwheels and the occasional snort from the mare. The path narrowed as they left town, trees crowding close on either side, their bare branches like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, the evening westbound to Kansas City. Cora found herself wondering what it might be like to board that train, to leave Oak Ridge and its memories behind. The thought brought an unexpected pang of loyalty to her father's memory. "Your father taught you his trade proper," Ephraim said suddenly, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. "Pa believed a person ought to have skills that couldn't be taken away," Cora replied, keeping her eyes on the path ahead. "Said it didn't matter if you were man or woman, so long as you knew the value of things." Ephraim nodded, shifting the wooden box to his other hand. His knuckles showed white where he gripped the handle. Sensible man. They rounded a bend in the path, and Cora's cabin came into view, a small weathered structure with smoke rising thinly from the stone chimney. She'd banked the morning fire carefully before leaving, hoping to preserve precious firewood. A crow took flight from the sagging roof corner, its harsh call breaking the stillness. "You've business with me, Mr. Burke?" Cora asked directly as they approached. The daylight was nearly gone now, and propriety demanded he state his purpose before they reached the cabin. He cleared his throat, that familiar gesture she'd noticed during their previous encounters. His free hand opened and closed at his side, betraying the calm he attempted to project. "I do." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Been giving thought to a personal predicament. Cora reined in the mare at the small clearing before her cabin. The windows were dark, and the November wind rattled the loose shutter she hadn't yet found time to fix. She turned to face Ephraim fully, waiting for him to continue. Her heart quickened despite her outward composure, some instinct telling her this moment mattered more than she yet understood. "My grandmother's health is failing," he said, his voice matter-of-fact, though she could detect the underlying concern. "Doctor says her heart's weakening. She needs more care than I can provide while maintaining the carpentry work." "I'm sorry to hear it," Cora replied sincerely. "Mrs. Burke was always kind to Pa." Ephraim nodded, his expression softening slightly at the mention of his grandmother. "She spoke well of your father, too, said he had an honest eye for value." He set the wooden box on the edge of the cart, his movements deliberate, though his fingers drummed briefly against the wood. Once, twice, before he withdrew his hand. "I've come to propose an arrangement, Miss Mason, one that might benefit us both." Cora felt a warning prickle along her spine, remembering Victor Holloway's arrangement all too clearly. She stiffened, her hand unconsciously finding the small cross at her throat. The metal was warm now beneath her fingers, a small comfort against the chill. Ephraim seemed to read her thoughts, and a flush rose in his face. "A proper arrangement," he clarified quickly, "before God and the law." He drew a deep breath, the cloud of it visible in the cold air between them. The moment stretched, taut with unspoken possibilities. A sudden gust of wind stirred the dead leaves at their feet, sending them skittering across the frozen ground. "I'm proposing marriage, Miss Mason." The words hung between them in the gathering darkness. An owl called from the nearby woods, its haunting cry punctuating the moment. "Marriage?" Cora repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. She remained perfectly still, though her heart had begun to pound against her ribs. A strange warmth spread through her. "A practical union," Ephraim continued, his voice steady despite the slight tremor she noticed in his hands as he rested them on the cart's edge. He'd removed his gloves at some point, she realized, as though wanting nothing between them during this conversation. "You'd have a proper home. Grandmother's home, with me." He paused, a flush coming to his cheeks, and then continued. "And you'd have security of reputation and fair partnership in my trade. Your skills with salvage could complement the carpentry work." He paused again, meeting her gaze directly. In the fading light, she could see the earnestness in his blue eyes, the same color as the forget-me-nots her mother had once planted beside their doorstep. "In return, my grandmother would have a woman's gentle care in her declining days, and I'd have the freedom to maintain the business that supports us." Cora studied his face, seeking any sign of deception or ulterior motive. She found none, only a frank openness that reminded her somehow of her father's direct manner. The practical terms he offered made sense, yet something in her hesitated. "You hardly know me, Mr. Burke," she said at last, her voice softer than she'd intended. "I know more than you might think," he replied, surprising her. "I know you're capable and resilient. I know you maintain your dignity despite this town's cruelty. I know you're skilled at a demanding trade that few men master, let alone women." His gaze moved briefly to the cross at her throat, then back to her eyes. "I know you seek the Lord's guidance in your decisions, as your father did." He glanced toward the cabin's sagging roof, where the first few snowflakes had begun to drift lazily downward from the darkened sky. "And I can see you're facing a hard winter alone." The truth of his last statement stung, though there was no mockery in his tone. The roof would not survive the first heavy snow, and her meager savings would not cover the necessary repairs. The firewood stacked beside the cabin would last perhaps another 3 weeks if used sparingly. In that moment, Cora felt the full weight of her solitude pressing down upon her shoulders like the snow that would soon blanket the hills around them. "Why not hire someone to help with your grandmother?" she asked, still searching for the catch in his proposal. "Surely there are women in town who need the work." "Tried that route," Ephraim admitted, running a hand across the back of his neck in a gesture that spoke of fatigue and worry. "Nobody suitable willing to work for what I can pay, the ones who'd consider it." His voice trailed off, and he frowned slightly. "Margaret Burke's particular about who enters her home. She's mentioned you specifically as someone she'd welcome." Cora raised an eyebrow at this information, genuine surprise displacing her wariness momentarily. "Your grandmother's suggested this arrangement?" A faint flush colored Ephraim's cheeks, visible even in the dimming light. "Not in so many words, but she reminds me regularly that a household needs both a man's strength and a woman's wisdom." He adjusted his cap. "I believe she'd approve the match." Cora's mind worked rapidly, weighing the proposition against her dwindling options. A proper home in town meant protection from the looming winter and from men like Victor Holloway. Care for Margaret Burke, a woman who had shown kindness to her father, seemed a fair exchange. Yet marriage meant trusting a man she barely knew, however honorable he seemed. "It would be a marriage in name?" she asked cautiously, her eyes dropping to the frozen ground between them, where snow now dusted the scattered leaves. Ephraim cleared his throat again, shifting his weight. "It would be a legal and binding marriage before God and man," he said carefully, "with all the respect such a covenant demands. I'm offering partnership, Miss Mason, not charity or—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I am not going to insist that we consummate the marriage, if that is your concern." His voice was soft, steady. "That's plain enough," thought Cora, feeling a blush heat her cheeks. Yet the sincerity in his voice reached something deep within Cora. This was no Victor Holloway, offering protection with predatory intent. Holloway wouldn't even have offered the dignity of his name. The wind picked up, carrying with it the first real snowfall of the season. Delicate flakes caught in Cora's eyelashes, melting against the warmth of her skin. In the distance, she could hear the lonely, fading whistle of the train. "I should think on it," she said finally, brushing a snowflake from her cheek. Ephraim nodded, seeming both relieved she hadn't outright refused and understanding of her need to consider carefully. He reached for the wooden box he'd placed on the cart. "Brought these," he said, opening the lid to reveal a collection of hinges, drawer pulls, and other metal fittings. "Thought they might fetch a fair price from McAllister. Grandmother had them stored in the attic from when my grandfather was building the house." "That's thoughtful," she acknowledged, accepting the gift without further comment. A gift given when a man is proposing isn't precisely charity, even if it is a marriage of convenience he's offering, she thought, carefully opening the box. Inside, she noticed the items had been organized by type and metal, copper separate from brass, iron fittings grouped by size. The attention to detail spoke of respect for her trade. "I'll consider your proposal, Mr. Burke. Would you expect an answer by Sunday service?" The snow was falling more steadily now, collecting on his cap and shoulders. He hesitated, then added, "You might speak with Pastor Thomas if you've concerns. He knows me well enough, the good and the bad." The honest acknowledgment of his past impressed her more than any smooth assurances might have done. Cora had heard whispers of Ephraim Burke's history with gambling, though the details remained unclear to her. That he would reference it openly suggested a man at peace with his past, if not proud of it. "I'll call on him tomorrow," she decided aloud. "That would be suitable," he agreed, stepping back from the cart. Ephraim nodded once more, then reached into his pocket. "Almost forgot," he said, extending his hand toward her. "Roof patch. Noticed your south corner's looking troubled. It'll hold until a proper repair can be made." Cora accepted the small packet of tarred canvas, appropriate for temporary roof repairs. Again, the gift was practical rather than frivolous, meeting a specific need without drawing attention to her poverty. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, and she noticed his were as calloused as her own. "Much obliged," she said simply. "I'll take my leave then," Ephraim replied, tipping his cap slightly. Snowflakes clung to the wool like stars against the dark fabric. "Evening, Miss Mason." "Good evening, Mr. Burke." She watched as he turned and walked back toward town, his figure gradually disappearing into the gathering darkness and swirling snow. Only when he was completely out of sight did Cora lead the mare and cart the final few yards to her cabin. Inside, she lit the lamp with hands that weren't quite steady, then placed the box of metal fittings on the small table she and her father had shared for meals. The cabin felt colder and emptier than usual, the silence pressing against her like a physical presence. Through the window, she could see the snow falling more heavily now. Cora moved to the stone hearth, stirring the banked coals and adding a few precious pieces of kindling. As the small flames took hold, illuminating the cabin with golden light, she sank onto the bench before the fire. She wondered what Samuel Mason would make of Ephraim Burke's proposal. Would he see it as providence or merely practicality? Her fingers traced the edge of the box Ephraim had brought, the brass fittings gleaming in the firelight. The fire's warmth gradually seeped into her tired body as Cora considered the choice before her. Independence had its price, and it was proving steeper than she'd anticipated. Yet marriage, even a practical one, meant placing her trust and future in another's hands. Her fingers found the silver cross at her throat, seeking wisdom in its familiar contours. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering broken fences and weathered buildings alike with the same gentle blanket of white. There was a message in that, she thought, how the Lord could transform the broken into something beautiful. "Show me the path, Lord," she whispered into the quiet cabin. "Let me see it clear." As if in answer, a log in the fire shifted, sending a shower of sparks upward through the chimney. Cora watched them rise and disappear, like prayers ascending to heaven. For the first time in weeks, she felt a curious lightening of her spirit. "I don't know just yet how to answer him. But it's nice to be valued," she thought, "to be wanted, even if it is for practical reasons, and not love." Outside, the November wind continued its mournful song through the trees surrounding Samuel Mason's cabin, but for the first night since her father died, Cora didn't feel so alone. Chapter 7. Cora had risen before dawn, a lifetime habit that even her sleepless night, filled with circling thoughts of Ephraim's proposal, hadn't altered. After applying the roof patch to the worst of the leaks, a task that left her fingers numb despite her woolen gloves, she had harnessed the mare to the cart and made her morning collection rounds. Few people ventured out in the aftermath of the season's first snowfall, making her normal route unusually quiet and yielding little beyond a few scraps of metal from the blacksmith, who'd nodded to her with more civility than usual. By mid-afternoon, Cora found herself standing at the modest white gate that marked the entrance to Pastor Thomas and Sarah Wilson's home on Church Street. The small, clapboard house stood a respectful distance from the church itself, connected by a well-trodden path now covered in pristine snow. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and the kitchen windows glowed with warm light against the early winter dusk. Cora hesitated, her gloved hand resting on the gate latch, uncertainty making her stomach clench. Her conversation with Ephraim Burke, had left her more unsettled than she cared to admit. The practical advantages of his proposal were undeniable, yet the idea of binding herself to a man, even one as seemingly honorable as Ephraim, filled her with trepidation. She hadn't ever expected to marry, nor had she ever been entirely opposed, but most certainly she would have expected to marry for love, if marry at all. Maybe that's it, she thought. It's a perfectly reasonable solution that doesn't force me into a real marriage. But that closes the door on a real marriage altogether, doesn't it? Her thought threatened to swirl into a whirlwind of further confusion, but she was started out of her reverie. "Why, Cora Mason, don't stand there freezing, child. Come in, come in." Sarah Wilson had appeared at the door, her round face flushed from the kitchen heat, a flour-dusted apron tied around her ample waist. Her welcoming voice carried across the yard, brooking no argument. Cora found herself smiling despite her misgivings as she unlatched the gate and made her way up the shoveled path, the snow crunching beneath her boots. "I hope I'm not intruding, Mrs. Wilson," Cora said as she reached the door, removing her woolen scarf. The sudden warmth of the house made her cheeks tingle painfully as blood returned to them. "Nonsense!" Sarah ushered her inside with a warm hand on her elbow. "And I've told you a dozen times to call me Sarah. Anyone who sat beside me through my Thomas's most harrowing Easter sermon to date, Lord have mercy, the man spoke for nearly 2 hours, has earned that right." The kitchen embraced Cora with its warmth and aromas, cinnamon and apples, fresh bread, and the rich scent of beef stew simmering on the cast-iron stove. The modest room was immaculate yet welcoming, with braided rugs softening the wide plank floors and cheerful red-checked curtains framing the windows. A Bible lay open on a small side table, a pair of spectacles folded neatly beside them. Above the fireplace hung a sampler with carefully stitched words, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." A fat tabby cat dozed in a patch of sunlight on the window seat, opening one eye briefly to assess the visitor before returning to its nap. "Let me take your things," Sarah insisted, helping Cora remove her coat and hanging it on a peg near the door. Water droplets from melting snow pattered softly onto the floor beneath it. "Thomas is visiting the McCullums. Little Mary has taken ill." Her shrewd green eyes assessed Cora with motherly concern. "You're looking peaked. When did you last eat a proper meal?" Before Cora could respond, Sarah was ladling stew into a blue-rimmed bowl and cutting a thick slice of fresh bread. The casual kindness brought a sudden and unexpected lump to Cora's throat. Since her father's death, such simple human warmth had been in short supply. Her eyes prickled with unexpected tears, which she blinked away quickly, embarrassed by the emotion. "That's mighty kind, but I didn't come for feeding," Cora protested weakly as Sarah set the food before her at the kitchen table. "The Lord provides, Cora, and sometimes He does it through a pot of stew." Sarah poured 2 cups of tea from a floral china teapot, the steam rising in fragrant curls. Bracing yourself against the world alone takes strength, and strength requires nourishment. She sat across from her visitor, her chair creaking slightly. "Now, while you put something in your stomach, why don't you tell me what's troubling you? Women rarely trudge through fresh snow for idle conversation." The directness was pure Sarah Wilson. No pretense, no circling around difficult subjects. Cora found her tension easing as she took a spoonful of the rich stew. The warmth spread through her. Her fingers gradually regained feeling as they curved around the warm bowl. "I've received a proposal of marriage," Cora said, the words sounding strange to her own ears. Her pulse quickened just saying it aloud, making it more real than when it had existed only in her thoughts. "From Ephraim Burke." If Sarah was surprised, she hid it well. She merely nodded thoughtfully adding a spoonful of honey to her tea, the small silver spoon clinking against the porcelain. "I see. And you've come seeking counsel, I imagine." "I have," Cora admitted, breaking off a piece of bread. Its yeasty aroma reminded her of Saturday mornings when her mother had been alive, the cabin filling with the comfort of baking day. "He's spoken well of Pastor Thomas, knowing his character," said the pastor knows the good and the bad of him. "Thomas has indeed known Ephraim since he first arrived in Oak Ridge," Sarah confirmed. Her hands, reddened from years of household work, cradled her teacup. The plain gold band on her left hand caught the light from the window. "The man who stepped off that train 7 years ago was a far cry from the Ephraim Burke you know today." Cora's spoon paused midway to her mouth, a drop of broth falling back into the bowl. "He mentioned having a past. I've heard whispers of gambling." "More than whispers would be truth," Sarah said frankly. "He came to Oak Ridge with nothing but shame and the clothes on his back. His grandmother took him in despite the scandal his father had brought on the family name. William Burke, Ephraim's father, drank and gambled away everything they had. Margaret says he died in a saloon with cards still in his hand." Cora set down her spoon. "And Ephraim followed the same path?" "For a time," Sarah acknowledged. "But the difference, Thomas always says, is that Ephraim found his way back before it was too late. The first year he was here, it was a near thing. Some nights Thomas would sit with him till dawn, just to make sure he didn't slip away to the saloon." She leaned forward, her voice softening. "That kind of battle shows what a person's made of, Cora. It's one thing never to face temptation. It's another to stare it down day after day and choose the harder path." The revelation painted Ephraim in a new light, not just as the steady carpenter with the quiet manner, but as a man who had faced his demons and, with help, overcome them. Cora thought of her father's occasional comments about Ephraim. Man's building himself back up piece by piece. Takes a certain kind of courage. She recalled the careful precision of Ephraim's workshop, the methodical way he organized his tools, the careful way he offered kindness so that it wouldn't trample pride. The kitchen door opened, bringing a brief rush of cold air as Pastor Thomas entered, stamping snow from his boots on the braided mat. He was a sturdy man with kind eyes and graying sandy hair, his well-worn black coat dusted with snow. A leather-bound Bible was tucked under one arm. "Cora, what a pleasant surprise!" He hung his coat beside Cora's and approached the table with his characteristic slight limp. "I was just visiting the McCullums. Little Mary's fever has broken, thank the Lord." His expression shifted as he noted the serious atmosphere in the kitchen. "But I suspect you're not here for news of the parish." "Cora has received a proposal from Ephraim Burke," Sarah explained, rising to pour her husband a cup of tea. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, the sound homey and reassuring. Thomas's eyebrows rose as he took a seat at the table, the chair scraping softly against the floor. Has she indeed? He accepted the tea with a nod of thanks to his wife, his weathered hands curling around the cup for warmth. "And you've come to inquire about the man's character, I imagine." Cora felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "About that, yes," she confirmed, forcing herself to meet his gaze directly. "And ... She hesitated, fingers finding the cross at her throat, the silver warm from her skin. "About whether such a match would be prudent. It's a practical arrangement he's proposing. Care for his grandmother in exchange for a home in town and partnership in his trade." Pastor Thomas considered this, his weathered hands wrapped around his teacup. The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background, punctuating the silence. Outside, a cardinal alighted briefly on the windowsill, its red plumage bright against the snow before flying off again. Cora found herself holding her breath, waiting for his assessment. "Ephraim Burke is not the man who arrived in Oak Ridge 7 years ago," he said at length, his voice carrying the measured cadence of his sermons, though gentler. "I've watched him rebuild his life through honest work day by day. He doesn't speak of his struggles often, but they've shaped him into a man of uncommon integrity." "He attends services regular," Sarah added, returning to her seat. The wooden chair creaked softly beneath her. "Never misses rain or shine, and he provides for his grandmother with real devotion." "But a marriage requires more than good church attendance and familial duty," Thomas cautioned, his tone gentle but direct. "Especially for a woman with your independent spirit, Cora." Cora felt a flicker of defensiveness at the characterization, accurate though it was. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. "I've managed well enough these past weeks," she said, more sharply than she'd intended. Then, remembering the persistent leaks in her roof and the dwindling firewood, she added more softly, "Though winter brings its challenges." Sarah and Thomas exchanged a glance, a silent communication that Cora found herself unexpectedly envying. What would it be like, she wondered, to know another person so well that words became almost unnecessary? "No one questions your capability," Sarah said kindly, reaching across to touch Cora's hand briefly. Her skin was rough from work, but warm. "But winter in that cabin alone would test anyone's resolve. And Oak Ridge can be—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The town can be unforgiving to those who don't fit neatly into its expectations." "Like a woman continuing her father's trade," Cora said softly, remembering the stares and whispers that followed her through town. The memory of men laughing as she gathered her spilled goods from the mud still stung. Pastor Thomas nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Like that, yes, and like a man with Ephraim's history. Both of you have faced the town's judgment in different ways." Cora considered this. She and Ephraim had indeed each been measured against Oak Ridge's narrow standards and found wanting. The knowledge brought an unexpected sense of kinship. Perhaps that shared experience was part of what had prompted his proposal. "May I speak plainly, Cora?" Sarah asked, setting down her teacup with a decisiveness that suggested she would do so regardless of permission. The porcelain clinked against the saucer with finality. Cora nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips, despite herself. Sarah Wilson's plain speaking was legendary in Oak Ridge. "Marriage begins for all manner of reasons," Sarah said, her eyes meeting Cora's directly. "Some for love, some for land, some for security or children. The beginning matters less than what's built day by day thereafter." She reached across the table to take her husband's hand, a gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. "Thomas and I began as a practical arrangement ourselves." Cora couldn't hide her surprise. Her spoon clattered against her bowl as she set it down too quickly. The Wilsons' evident affection for each other was a fixture in Oak Ridge, as reliable as Sunday services. "Truly?" Thomas chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Truly. I was a young pastor with my first congregation, and the church elders made it quite clear that a minister needed a wife to properly serve the community. Sarah was the school teacher, considered a bit too outspoken for most suitors' taste. I had opinions about Scripture, Sarah explained with mock solemnity, though her eyes twinkled, most unseemly in a woman. I was blessed that the other suitors were so short-sighted, Thomas said, his gaze softening as he looked at his wife. I was 26, Sarah continued, smoothing her apron with work-worn hands. Practically a confirmed spinster by Oak Ridge standards, Thomas proposed after exactly 3 chaperoned walks and 1 church picnic. Said we could do good work together for the Lord and the community. She smiled at the memory. most unromantic proposal imaginable. "I did mention your excellent apple pies," Thomas protested mildly, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "As a complimentary skill to your ministry," Sarah retorted, though her eyes sparkled with affection. Not exactly a declaration of undying passion. Cora watched their easy banter with fascination, her tea forgotten in her hands. The genuine warmth between them was palpable. "Yet you accepted." "I did." Sarah's expression grew more serious. "I loved teaching, but in those days, married women weren't permitted in the classroom. I had to choose between my independence and increasing isolation, or marriage to a kind, if rather reserved, man who respected my mind." She squeezed her husband's hand before turning back to Cora. "Love grew between us, nurtured by shared purpose and daily kindnesses." Cora absorbed this, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her teacup. The delicate porcelain felt fragile beneath her work-roughened hands. "But how did you know you could trust him?" The question hung in the air. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder in the moment of silence that followed. Pastor Thomas leaned forward slightly, his expression compassionate. "Trust is built step by step, Cora. I showed Sarah I was trustworthy by keeping small promises before asking her to believe in the larger ones." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "Ephraim has been rebuilding trust with himself, with his grandmother, with this community, for 7 years. Every day he makes the choice to honor his commitments rather than flee from them. That speaks to a man's character more eloquently than words ever could." Cora thought of the mended cartwheel, the carefully organized box of metal fittings, the roof patch provided without being asked. Small acts that demonstrated consideration and reliability. Her father had judged people by their actions rather than their words. By that measure, Ephraim had shown himself to be thoughtful and dependable. "Has Ephraim mentioned Victor Holloway in his proposal?" Sarah asked suddenly, her tone sharpening as she set down her teacup with more force than necessary. Cora looked up, startled by the unexpected question. Why would he? Another glance passed between the Wilsons, this one tinged with concern that made Cora's stomach tighten. "Victor has made his interest in you rather public knowledge," Pastor Thomas said. "As your pastor, I should mention that his intentions may not be entirely honorable despite his position in town." Cora felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment and indignation mingling. "He offered me a position as his housekeeper," she said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "I declined." Sarah's expression hardened momentarily, transforming her usually warm countenance. A wise decision. The previous housekeeper left town under difficult circumstances. Cora remembered the woman, barely older than herself, who had departed Oak Ridge hastily last spring, her condition visible despite attempts to conceal it. A chill ran through her as she recalled the woman's frightened eyes. "I am certain," Pastor Thomas continued carefully, "Victor Holloway's intentions are part of Ephraim's concern for you." Cora studied the remains of her stew, considering this new perspective. Was Ephraim's proposal partly motivated by a desire to protect her from Holloway? "I wouldn't want to be married out of someone's sense of obligation," she said finally, voicing one of her deepest fears. Sarah made a soft sound that was neither quite agreement nor disagreement. "Few marriages begin with perfect motives, Cora," she began, repeating her earlier wisdom. "Many grow strong despite beginning with far less." She rose to stoke the fire, the iron poker clinking against the grate. "And from what I've observed, Ephraim Burke is a man who honors his obligations, not from duty alone, but from true integrity." Pastor Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. The good book tells us that faith without works is dead. The same might be said of love. It's revealed in action, in daily choices. Then he leaned forward, echoing his wife's earlier words. Those who expect love to arrive fully formed often find themselves disappointed. His face was kind in the glow of the firelight. "I didn't come here expecting simple answers," Cora admitted after a moment of silence. Her fingers traced the pattern on the china saucer, following its blue curves. "But I suppose I did hope I'd know my mind better after tonight." Sarah returned to the table, laying a gentle hand on Cora's shoulder. Sometimes clarity comes like dawn, gradually illuminating the path ahead, one step at a time. Cora nodded, drawing comfort from the familiar verse that had guided many of her father's decisions. "I've been praying for guidance, and he's led you here as a first step," Sarah said with practical certainty. The flames from the hearth danced in her eyes, bringing warmth to her expression. "Now, before you go, I'm sending you home with some of this stew and a loaf of fresh bread. The Lord's wisdom comes easier on a full stomach, I always say." Despite her protests, Cora soon found herself wrapped once more in her coat and scarf, a basket containing carefully packed food in her hands. Sarah had insisted on adding a jar of her apple preserves and a small packet of dried herbs to keep winter ills at bay. The simple generosity brought that troublesome lump back to Cora's throat. Sarah's kind mothering had been a constant in her life for so long now. At the door, Sarah embraced her warmly. The scent of cinnamon and flour enveloped Cora in memories of childhood comfort. "Whatever you decide, remember you're not alone," the older woman said then. "The Lord walks beside you, and so do those who care for you." Pastor Thomas nodded agreement. "We'll be praying for your discernment, Cora." His kind eyes held hers for a moment, and the three bid one last good night. As Cora made her way back to her waiting cart in the gathering dusk, she found her mind returning to Sarah's words about their marriage. Love grew between us, nurtured by shared purpose and daily kindnesses. Could such growth happen between herself and Ephraim Burke? Was the practical foundation he offered solid enough to build upon? The questions still circled in her mind, but they seemed less daunting now. She guided the mare toward home, the basket of food a comforting weight on her lap. Snow crunched beneath the cartwheels, and her breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as her thoughts swirled within. Did she want a business marriage with Ephraim that might turn into something more? He's an attractive man. The thought brought warmth to her cheeks, making her shiver as only the hint of warmth could, when it hadn't the strength to fully banish the cold. "I do think we could easily be friends. If I am very honest, Lord, I want my marriage to be one of love," she spoke aloud, the soft prayer an invitation for the Lord to join her tumultuous thoughts. But do I want the man I love one day to be Ephraim? She didn't have a ready answer for that thought or for any of her swirling questions, but she knew one thing for certain. However sensible, however pragmatic, she wouldn't even consider this proposal had it come from any other man. As the old mare plodded homeward through the deepening twilight, Cora found herself humming softly, a hymn her mother had often sung while working, "Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart." The familiar melody carried her through the winter evening, a prayer rising from her soul as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, like distant lanterns guiding her way home. Chapter 8. In the small bedroom of the parsonage where Sarah Wilson had insisted she spend the night. "No bride should walk to her own wedding alone, dear." Cora stood before the oval mirror, studying her reflection with a critical eye. The dress wasn't new. Sarah had altered one of her own, a simple navy blue with a modest bustle and white lace collar. The color was practical, dark enough to serve for church and town occasions beyond today's ceremony, but the craftsmanship of Sarah's modifications gave it a quiet dignity. Cora's auburn hair was arranged in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, adorned only with a sprig of dried lavender from Sarah's kitchen stores. The familiar scent mingled with beeswax polish from the furniture and the distant aroma of cinnamon and apples, baking for the modest wedding breakfast to follow. Cora ran her work-roughened fingers over the smooth fabric, the subtle texture a stark contrast to the rough canvas of her father's collection apron. It was hard not to miss him on this day. "You look lovely," Sarah said, entering with a steaming cup of tea, the fragrant blend of chamomile and mint wafting between them. Her kind eyes assessed Cora with motherly approval. "Something borrowed," she added, gesturing to the dress. "Something blue as well. Your mother's cross for something old." She placed the teacup on the small bedside table, the china softly clinking against the wooden surface, and reached into her pocket. "And this for something new." She pressed a small handkerchief into Cora's palm, the edges delicately embroidered with tiny forget-me-nots and Cora's new initials, CB. "You've been too kind," Cora murmured, her fingers tracing the careful stitches. The realization that within the hour she would legally become Cora Burke sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. The silver cross at her throat felt suddenly heavy. "Kindness costs little and yields much," Sarah replied simply. "Pastor Thomas is waiting downstairs when you're ready." She squeezed Cora's hand once before leaving her alone with her thoughts. Cora took a steadying breath, her hand reaching for the cross at her throat. "Guide my steps, Lord," she whispered. "Grant me courage for this journey." The church stood silent and mostly empty when Cora entered on Pastor Thomas's arm. The wooden doors creaked open, admitting them to an interior scented with beeswax candles and aging hymnals. Cool air held captive by the thick stone walls. November being a working month, few in Oak Ridge could spare the time for a mid-week wedding, leastways not for the rag collector's daughter and the reformed gambler. Only the front pew was occupied. Sarah Wilson sat beside Margaret Burke, who despite her declining health had insisted on attending. The elderly woman's blue eyes, so like her grandson's, followed Cora's progress with keen interest. And then there was Ephraim, standing alone before the altar. He wore his Sunday suit, recently pressed by the look of it, and a clean white shirt with a dark tie. His dark hair was neatly combed, though one stubborn lock had already fallen across his forehead. His work-worn hands, capable of such precision with saw and plane, were clasped before him, his knuckles white with tension. When he turned at the sound of their entrance, the naked emotion on his face startled Cora. Her breath caught. Had he been waiting long? Cora wondered. Had he feared she might change her mind? She remembered his slow smile when she'd given her answer. The way he'd rushed off to inform his grandmother, almost as if he were delivering a treasure. She had felt vaguely flustered. Theirs was meant to be a practical arrangement. Pastor Thomas guided her forward. Each step on the worn wooden floorboards echoed in the empty church. Ephraim's eyes never left her face as she approached. When she took her place beside him, Cora noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he unclasped them. He smelled of soap and wood shavings. It helped a great deal that she could see his own nerves, that the sense of how welcome she would be in his life had grown steadily in the short time since she'd agreed to become his wife. It somehow steadied her and worried her all at once. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Thomas began, his voice warm and steady as it resonated in the vaulted space. "We are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Cora as she stood rigid beside the man who would soon be her husband. A pale rectangle of November sunlight fell across the altar from the high windows, dust motes dancing in its beam. The wooden cross behind the pulpit cast a long shadow across the floor, a silent witness to countless vows spoken before theirs. Ecclesiastes tells us, Pastor Thomas continued, his Bible open before him, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. He looked between them, a gentle twinkle emerging in his eyes. It's a beautiful foundational verse for marriage. Cora noticed Ephraim Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard, his gaze briefly lowering to the floor before returning steady and resolute. Cora felt him shift slightly beside her, his arm brushing against hers. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, despite the chill air. "Ephraim Burke, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise to love, honor, cherish, and protect her, forsaking all others and holding only unto her, forevermore?" Ephraim's voice was low but steady. "I do." 2 simple words, spoken firmly enough that they echoed slightly in the empty church. Cora glanced at his face. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, but his throat worked with emotion. "Cora Mason, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Do you promise to love, honor, cherish, and protect him, forsaking all others and holding only unto him forevermore?" Cora instinctively found the silver cross at her throat. She trembled with the enormity of the promise. "I do," she said, her voice barely audible. "The ring, if you please," Pastor Thomas prompted. Ephraim reached into his pocket, producing a simple gold band. Cora hadn't expected a ring at all. Many working-class marriages in Oak Ridge dispensed with them for practical reasons. Yet here was tangible proof of his commitment to their arrangement. "This ring is a symbol of your vows," Pastor Thomas explained. "A circle without end, representing a covenant without end. What God has joined together, let no one separate." When Ephraim took her hand, Cora was startled by the tremor in his fingers. His skin was warm against hers, the calluses of his hands catching slightly on her skin as he slid the ring onto her finger. A perfect fit, she noted with surprise. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "With this ring," he repeated after Pastor Thomas, "I thee wed." The band felt strange and foreign on Cora's finger, its weight unfamiliar. She resisted the urge to twist it, to test it was real. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Pastor Thomas smiled gently. "You may kiss your bride." A flush rose in Ephraim's face, coloring his cheeks and the tips of his ears. They hadn't discussed this part. For a moment he seemed frozen, uncertain. His eyes met hers briefly, a question in them that Cora couldn't quite answer. Then he leaned forward and pressed his lips briefly against Cora's cheek. The contact so light and quick she might have imagined it, yet warm enough to send an unexpected flutter through her chest. His hand squeezed hers once before releasing it. It was done. She was Cora Burke now. As they turned to face their small audience, Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Margaret Burke nodded once, a gesture containing both approval and expectation. The church remained silent, only the soft ticking of the wall clock and the distant call of crows from the churchyard. "May I be the first to congratulate Mr. and Mrs. Burke," Pastor Thomas said, breaking the silence. His voice echoed slightly in the nearly empty church, the words, Mrs. Burke, sending a strange thrill of unfamiliarity through Cora. "Welcome to the family, my dear," Margaret said as Cora approached, her frail hand extended. Despite her evident weakness, dignity radiated from the older woman, who sat perfectly upright in her dark blue dress, a cameo brooch at her throat. "I'm pleased Ephraim found a woman of character." Her piercing blue eyes, so like her grandson's, assessed Cora with surprising sharpness. Cora took the offered hand, noticing how the veins stood out like rivers on a map the skin paper-thin yet warm. "Thank you, Mrs. Burke," she replied, uncertain how to address her new grandmother-by-law. "Margaret will do," the older woman corrected gently. "We're family now." She glanced toward Ephraim, who stood conversing quietly with Pastor Thomas. "He's a good man," she added softly for Cora's ears alone. "Better than he believes himself to be. My son William, Ephraim's father, left him a hard legacy to overcome." Cora hadn't expected such frankness on their first meeting as family. The mention of Ephraim's father surprised her. "He seems to have overcome it well," she offered cautiously. Margaret's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "With help from above and effort from within," she agreed. "The Lord does not promise an absence of struggle, only the strength to face it." Her gaze was shrewd as it returned to Cora. "I suspect you understand that better than most." Ephraim approached then, ending their private conversation. He bent to kiss his grandmother's cheek with obvious affection. "Ready for some wedding cake, grandmother? Sarah's been baking since dawn." "As if I would miss it," Margaret replied with a hint of spirit. "Sarah's pecan spice cakes are legendary." The small group moved toward the parsonage. As they walked the short pathway between church and house, Cora felt Ephraim's hand hesitantly touch her elbow, steadying her on a slippery patch of cobblestones. "May I have a moment?" he asked quietly, when the others had drawn ahead, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Cora nodded, surprised by the request. Ephraim reached into his pocket and drew out a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. "I made this," he said simply, pressing it into her hands. "Not much of a wedding gift, perhaps, but—" He trailed off. Cora untied the string with fingers suddenly clumsy, peeling back the paper to reveal a small wooden box. The craftsmanship was exquisite, dovetailed corners, a polished finish that gleamed in the winter light, and the lid inlaid with a pattern of tiny stars. "For your mother's cross," Ephraim explained, watching her face carefully. "I noticed you touch it when you're thinking or worried. Thought you might want a proper place to keep it safe." "It's beautiful," Cora said, running her finger over the silky smooth surface. "Thank you." He nodded once, seeming relieved. "You look very nice," he added quietly. "Thank you for—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "For becoming my wife." Chapter 9. Ephraim guided the borrowed wagon to a stop. The simple wedding ceremony at the church had concluded hours ago, and now came the practical matter of gathering Cora's belongings. Cora moved with quiet efficiency, wrapping her few treasured possessions in scraps of fabric before placing them in wooden crates. A small collection of books, borrowed from Pastor Thomas, no doubt, were stacked neatly beside a work table covered with precisely arranged buttons, fabric samples, and metal findings. She'd organized everything with a system he couldn't immediately discern, but suspected was purposeful. "Your organization would put my workshop to shame," Ephraim offered, attempting to lighten the heavy silence. Cora glanced up, a faint smile touching her lips before fading. "My father believed everything had its place. Order in your tools means order in your mind," he'd say. Ephraim nodded, recognizing the wisdom, a carpenter's creed as well. He watched as she wrapped a tarnished silver hand mirror in velvet, her movements reverent. The cabin contained few decorative items. Practical necessity had clearly governed their lives, but each object she chose to bring seemed weighted with memory. "The chest by the wall," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion Ephraim sensed beneath. "If you wouldn't mind." Together they worked, loading her belongings onto the wagon. Cora maintained her composure until the moment came to close the door. She paused at the threshold, her slender fingers tracing the worn wood of the doorframe where marks noting her height at different ages had been carved. His voice was gentle when he spoke. "Cora, this home still belongs to you. Our marriage doesn't change that." Ephraim cleared his throat. "Perhaps when the weather turns warmer, we might see to some repairs together." Her brown eyes were full of pleased surprise when she turned to him. "You'd do that? I reckon a good workshop shouldn't go to waste. Your father had a fine eye for materials." Cora's gaze held his for a long moment. "Thank you," she said simply. As they finished loading the wagon, their hands reached simultaneously for the last bundle, a stack of her father's account books. Ephraim felt warmth spread through him when their hands touched, and he didn't remove his hand right away. When he did pull his hand away, the movement was almost a caress. "Idiot," he thought, "it's too soon." "My apologies," he murmured, stepping back to allow her to secure the books. Cora nodded, a flush rising to her cheeks as she carefully placed the ledgers in the wagon. "All set then," she said, her voice barely audible above the soft whistle of the winter wind through the bare oak branches. The journey back to town passed in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the wagon creaked over the snow-dusted road. The afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening across the white-covered landscape by the time they reached Church Street, where Margaret Burke's home stood, one of the original town houses, showing graceful aging, yet still maintaining an air of quiet dignity. Cora stood at the base of the wide front porch steps. My home now, she reminded herself. The day's journey had been like a dream. At the top of the porch steps, Margaret Burke sat in a chair that had been positioned there, allowing her to welcome them without the strain of standing. Though she had attended the wedding ceremony earlier that day, the exertion had clearly taken its toll. Despite her fatigue, her white hair remained neatly pinned, and she held herself with dignity, a polished wooden cane resting against her chair. "Welcome home, my dear," Margaret said, extending her free hand. Cora climbed the last few steps, conscious of Ephraim following with her trunk. She'd been touched by Margaret's presence at the ceremony, especially knowing the effort it must have cost the elderly woman. "Thank you for the welcome, Mrs. Burke," Cora replied. "Margaret, please," the older woman reminded gently. "We're family now, after all." Ephraim disappeared to retrieve more of Cora's belongings, while Margaret led her slowly into a modest but comfortable sitting room. A small table had been set, with a china tea service that Cora recognized as good-quality porcelain, likely passed down through generations. She thought self-consciously of her own salvaged goods, soon to be unpacked next to such heirlooms. "I've prepared a small refreshment," Margaret said, gesturing to the tea set. Cora sat carefully on the offered chair, resisting the urge to check her dress for dirt or tears before touching the fine furniture. She took a steadying breath. It was so often easier to face scorn rather than acceptance. "Ephraim knew your status well," she thought to herself, and that was clear as day in his proposal. She felt faintly amused at the scolding of her thoughts. This family was more than the sum of their possessions. "My family now," she thought. "You're very kind," she said to Margaret. "Not kind," Margaret corrected, pouring tea with practiced ease despite her arthritic hands. "Pleased. This house has needed a woman's touch beyond my aging efforts." As they sipped tea, Cora found her fingers unconsciously sorting the teaspoons on the table by size, a habit she'd developed during her father's long illness. "Those are lovely buttons," the older woman commented a short while later, as Cora unpacked a small wooden box containing her prized collection. "May I see them?" Cora hesitated before opening the box wider. "They're just odds and ends I've found, or salvaged. Nothing fine." Margaret carefully selected a tarnished brass button embossed with an anchor pattern. "Naval officer's uniform, mid-century," she identified. "And this one, She pointed to a delicate mother-of-pearl specimen, would have adorned a lady's evening dress. French, I believe, by the workmanship. Cora stared in surprise. How did you know? My late husband's mother was a collector, Margaret explained, returning the buttons carefully. I have a small collection of my own. I'd like to show you later if you're interested. After tea, Margaret's eyelids began to droop slightly, the day's excitement clearly catching up with her. Forgive me, she said, patting Cora's hand. The wedding was a joyous occasion, but I find I must rest now. Ephraim will show you where everything is, she said. The east bedroom gets the morning light. I had him prepare it for you. Best place for detailed work, if you're of a mind to continue your crafts. Cora hadn't expected to be granted dedicated space for her work. You wouldn't mind? Mind, my dear, every home needs useful hands employing their gifts, and it will be a delight to watch your creations emerge with my own eyes. She gave Cora a gentle smile. In the east bedroom, Cora unpacked her belongings, still in her simple wedding dress from the morning's ceremony. She carefully arranged her fabric scraps, threads, and tools on the small table beneath the window. The room was simply furnished but meticulously clean, with a patchwork quilt in blues and browns covering the narrow bed. A small wardrobe stood against one wall, and beside it, partially hidden by a cloth, was what appeared to be an unfinished piece of furniture. Curiosity drew her to it. Pulling back the covering, she discovered a writing desk, beautifully crafted in oak but incomplete, the drawer pulls missing, the writing surface unfinished. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each joint perfectly matched. It was meant for the doctor's wife. Ephraim's voice came from the doorway, startling her. But they preferred something in mahogany instead. I never found the right purpose for it. Cora let her fingers trace the grain of the wood. The color is remarkable. Heart oak, Ephraim explained, maintaining a respectful distance. Takes the light in a particular way. Cora nodded, then moved to her collection of fabrics. After a moment's search, she extracted a piece of blue wool. I've this piece. Been saving it. The color would bring out those amber tones in the oak, I think. For the writing surface, perhaps. Ephraim approached, examining the fabric with a craftsman's attention. His eyebrows rose slightly. You've a good eye. Where did you find such a piece? The mill owner's wife discarded a damaged cloak. The moth holes are at one end, but there's plenty of sound material. Pa always... Her voice faded as she hesitated. Go on, Ephraim encouraged. I'd like to know more about your father. Well now, Cora smoothed the fabric against the wood. Pa always said true craftsmanship is knowing which pieces belong together, even if others can't see it yet. Ephraim studied the combination, then met her eyes directly. I have a customer, the milliner, who's been after me for a sewing table. Would you consider, that is, might you be willing to advise on suitable pairings of fabric with the wood? She'd pay extra for something distinctive. Cora felt a spark of interest. I could do that. We could work out a fair division of the proceeds, Ephraim added hastily, your contribution being as valuable as the woodwork. He took a deep breath, his words more measured when he continued. I'll let you get settled in. I've a small errand to tend to at the shop. He paused as she nodded and gave her a gentle smile in return. A sense of peace stole over her as Ephraim took his leave. Not just shelter and security from this marriage. She kept the part of her work she'd always loved as well. Ephraim's errand had been a self-directed mission to give his wife a short while of privacy to settle into her new home. He puttered about in his shop, failing to concentrate on a single task he attempted. His thoughts kept straying toward his home, his new wife. Ephraim heard the gentle murmur of voices from the sitting room when he returned. Margaret had awakened from her rest. As he approached the doorway, he paused, taking in the scene before him. Cora and his grandmother sat together, a circular rag rug spread across their laps, its pattern woven in shades of green, brown, and cream. "Your father's work has always brought me joy," Margaret was saying, her arthritic fingers tracing the worn sections where the pattern had begun to fray. "I saw it when Samuel was collecting near the church years ago. Insisted on buying it for twice its asking price." She smiled at the memory. "I couldn't bear to part with it when it started showing wear, though these old hands can't manage the repairs it needs." Ephraim watched as Cora's fingers moved reverently over the weaving, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He was reminded of how short a time it had been since Samuel Mason died. "I remember when he made this," Cora said softly. "We had extra wool scraps that winter, from the mill owner's discards." She gently turned the rug to examine a section where the pattern had worn thin. "I could restore this. It wouldn't take much to bring it back to what it was." "Would you?" Margaret's eyes brightened. "It seems fitting it should come back to Samuel's daughter's hands." Ephraim felt something tighten in his chest, watching the two women, heads bent together over the rug, his grandmother's most prized materials scattered around them. He could see many of Cora's belongings had already found a place among his grandmother's and his own. She fit so perfectly into this home, though she'd only just arrived. "Don't stand in shadows, Ephraim," Margaret called then, though he'd made no sound. He wondered how long she'd been aware of him standing there. "Come show Cora those drawer pulls you've been carving." Cora looked up, a question in her eyes. "Drawer pulls." "For the desk," Ephraim explained, stepping into the warm lamplight. "Been working on them a while. Never seemed right until now." Later, when both women had retired, Ephraim sat at the small workbench that had once been his grandfather's study. His hands reached automatically for a piece of wood and his carving knife, a habit that had helped him through many nights when the old urges for cards and whiskey threatened. Tonight, however, he found himself carving a delicate oak leaf pattern along the handle of what would become a button hook, a small gift for Cora's collection. He was only beginning to admit to himself how much he cared for her. When would he be able to admit it to his wife? Chapter 10. Cora found Ephraim in his workshop, carefully planing the edge of what would become the writing desk's surface. He had brought it from home earlier in the week. The familiar sense of fresh-cut oak and beeswax polish wrapped around her as she closed the door against the wind. Ephraim looked up at the sound of the bell, his serious expression warming at the sight of her. Then his brow furrowed slightly as he studied her face. "You're troubled," he said, setting aside his plane. It wasn't a question. "It's nothing," Cora replied, unwilling to burden him with the town's unkindness. She removed her shawl and hung it on the wall peg, grateful for the workshop's warmth after the biting wind. "I've brought the fabric samples we discussed, the blue wool and several others that might complement the oak grain." Ephraim watched her carefully, unconvinced by her dismissal. "Cora," he said, his voice gentler than she had yet heard it, "what happened?" She began unpacking her basket, arranging fabric swatches with unnecessary precision on his workbench. "Merely the usual whispers. I've heard worse." "About me?" he asked quietly. Cora looked up, surprised. "About us both," she clarified. "Nothing worth repeating." Ephraim's jaw tightened, his hands opening and closing at his sides. He'd heard whispers himself, snide accusations she'd trapped him into marriage, insinuations he'd only married her out of pity, smug predictions that a marriage between a disgraced gambler and the rag picker's daughter was doomed from the outset. "I'm sorry," he said, startling her. "Why?" Cora asked. "The marriage," he clarified, moving to stand beside her at the workbench. I meant it to provide protection, yet it seems I've only given the gossips new material." His eyes held genuine regret. "You'd have been better served by a man with a cleaner history." The self-recrimination in his voice stirred something protective in Cora's chest. "Nonsense," she said firmly. "The women in this town would find fault with an angel if one descended from heaven wearing the wrong bonnet ribbon." Her vehemence surprised them both, and she softened her tone. "Besides, I'm no stranger to wagging tongues." Ephraim studied her face for a long moment. "Even so," he said finally, "I regret bringing you more trouble." "The trouble was always mine," Cora replied. "You're merely sharing it." She hadn't meant to sound so appreciative of the fact, but somehow it emerged that way. The jingle of the bell above the workshop door interrupted the moment. Ephraim looked up, expecting a customer, and Cora busied herself with arranging the fabric samples more methodically, grateful for the distraction from the unexpected warmth that had bloomed in her chest due to Ephraim's concern. Victor Holloway, resplendent in a tailored wool coat with polished brass buttons, stood just inside the door. The November wind ruffled his perfectly styled blonde hair as he removed his hat with practiced civility. "Burke," he acknowledged with a nod that managed to be both greeting and dismissal. His gaze shifted to Cora, a calculating assessment that made her instinctively still the urge to fidget. "And Mrs. Burke, how domestic." "Mr. Holloway," Ephraim replied, his tone neutral, though Cora noticed how he positioned himself between her and the visitor. "What brings you to my shop today?" "Business proposition," Victor replied, stepping over to view Ephraim's current work without invitation. His eyes traveled over the half-finished writing desk with affected casualness. "The bank's new manager requires office furnishings. I've taken the liberty of recommending your services despite certain—" He paused, a sneer emerging as he continued, "reservations." "What reservations would those be?" Ephraim asked quietly, going still, his eyes flicking toward the other man's face in cool assessment. Victor smiled thinly, removing his leather gloves one finger at a time. "One must consider reliability in business arrangements. A man's past habits often predict his future conduct, wouldn't you agree?" Cora felt heat rise to her cheeks at the insinuation. Before she could consider the wisdom of speaking, words sprang to her lips. "My husband's craftsmanship speaks for itself, Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt. "As does his character. The quality of his workmanship speaks to anyone who examines it." Both men turned to her with evident surprise. Victor recovered first, his smile tightening at the corners. "How charming to have found such a devoted advocate, Burke." Then his eyes turned to Cora again, and traced first her face and then her body, in a perusal that was as thorough as it was indecent. The sneer returned. "Your husband is most fortunate, my dear." "Holloway," Ephraim said, his voice dangerously quiet as he gently shifted Cora behind him. "You came to discuss business. Speak your piece and get out." Victor's eyebrows rose slightly at the steel in Ephraim's tone. "No insult intended, naturally," he replied with a dismissive wave. "Merely an observation on how fortuitous your arrangement appears to be for both parties. I'll return tomorrow to discuss the bank commission specifics. Do consider the opportunity carefully. Such patronage could elevate your standing considerably." "Good day," Victor concluded, settling his hat precisely back on his head before departing. When the door closed behind him, Cora released a long breath. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I spoke out of turn. If I've cost you the commission—" "Cora," Ephraim interrupted, his voice gentler than she expected. "You needn't apologize for speaking truth." His hand moved almost unconsciously to cover hers briefly before he seemed to realize what he'd done and withdrew it. Cora's skin tingled where his fingers had touched hers. She busied herself with refolding the blue wool fabric, unsettled by her body's response to such a simple contact. "He had no right to speak so," she said, her gaze fixed on the fabric's weave. "Your work deserves respect." She paused, but only briefly before continuing, "regardless of anything else." Ephraim said nothing for a long moment, simply watching her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every movement of her hands. Finally, he spoke. The bank commission would be significant. He deliberately returned to practical matters. "If you'd be willing, I'd value your eye for materials. I hear the manager's wife has particular tastes in upholstery." Cora looked up, surprised by the offer. "You wish me to help with selection and design?" "Your knowledge of fabrics exceeds mine," Ephraim said simply. "It would be foolish not to utilize such skill when it benefits us both." "I'd be glad to help," she replied, unable to prevent a small smile from forming. A routine developed between them in the days that followed. Each morning Cora would assist Margaret with household tasks before joining Ephraim at his workshop in town for several hours. There, she would consult with customers about fabric selections and finishes, while Ephraim crafted the wooden elements. They heard no more about the commission, but the writing desk progressed steadily, and slowly Cora found herself more and more aware of Ephraim, the careful precision with which he measured each piece, the way his expression softened when speaking of his grandmother, how the afternoon light caught highlights in his dark hair. One afternoon, as they bent together over a particularly intricate joint in the writing desk, Cora became acutely conscious of Ephraim's proximity. The workshop had grown warm despite the November chill outside, and he had rolled his shirt sleeves to the elbow, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of working wood. She caught the clean scent of soap and pine as he leaned closer, guiding her hand to feel the grain direction. "Like this," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he helped her hold the marking tool at the correct angle. "Follow the natural line." Cora nodded. When she glanced up, she found his gaze fixed on her face, rather than the wood between them. "You've sawdust," he said softly, reaching to brush something from her cheek. His fingers lingered for just a moment, the calloused pad of his thumb faintly rough against her skin. Something flickered in his eyes before he stepped away abruptly. "I should check on your grandmother," she said, needing distance to collect her suddenly scattered thoughts. "Of course," he agreed, turning back to his workbench with unnecessary attention to arranging his tools. The walk home through the November afternoon gave Cora time to consider the strange protectiveness she'd begun to feel toward Ephraim. A few short days ago, she had defended him to Victor without hesitation, had bristled at the gossip, not because it maligned her, but because it questioned his character. When had his reputation become so important to her? More unsettling still was the way her body responded to his presence, the quickening of her pulse when their hands touched, the warmth that spread through her when he stood near. This was not what she had agreed to when accepting his practical proposal. It wasn't what he had offered. But was the business arrangement what he still wanted? Did she? It was rather ridiculous. When she had been inclined to think he had feelings for her, she worried it might be true. Now that she began to suspect she had feeling for him, she began to worry he might not. As Cora approached the house, she saw Margaret watching for her from the window, a smile touching the older woman's lips as she raised her hand in greeting. Cora returned the gesture. That evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Margaret with her mending, Cora reading a volume she had borrowed from Sarah, and Ephraim carving by the fire, Cora found herself stealing glances at her husband's profile. She noticed the concentration in his expression as he worked, the gentle patience with which he answered questions about his day, the careful way he helped Margaret to bed when she tired. Why did her heart seem to tighten at these simple observations? And more troubling still, what would she do if these unexpected feelings were not reciprocated? You could simply ask him, she told herself. Her heart began beating faster. His answer would change everything. She stared down at her book, brow furrowed. Unless it changed nothing. She frowned at the pages before her. What had possessed her to keep turning pages while her mind tumbled in such circles? Chapter 11. Cora lay rigid beneath the quilts, listening to the house settle around her. The mantel clock in the parlor struck midnight, each chime echoing her racing thoughts. When would sleep claim her? Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Ephraim's face by lamplight, the concentration in his expression as he carved, the way his blue eyes had held hers when he'd brushed sawdust from her cheek. She pressed her palms against her hot cheeks, trying to banish the memory of his touch. This was madness. They had an understanding, a practical arrangement that had satisfied her just days ago. Why suddenly did it feel insufficient? The hunger pangs in her stomach provided a welcome distraction. She'd barely touched her supper, too aware of Ephraim's presence across the table, too confused by her own responses to eat. Perhaps if she filled her stomach, her mind might settle enough for sleep. Cora slipped from bed, wrapping her thick woolen wrapper over her nightgown against the November chill. The floorboards creaked softly as she made her way downstairs, careful to avoid the third step that always groaned loudest. She needn't wake the household for her foolishness. The kitchen held a peaceful stillness, moonlight streaming through the windows to create pools of silver on the well-worn wooden floor. Cora located the bread box by touch, retrieving the remains of Sarah Wilson's morning gift, dark rye still fragrant with caraway seeds. As she reached for the butter crock on the shelf, the sudden scratch of a match made her heart leap. "Couldn't sleep either." Ephraim's voice, low and sleep-roughened, emerged from the shadows near the window. The match flared briefly as he lit a candle, revealing his disheveled state. Dark hair uncombed, shirt half-buttoned, suspenders hanging loose at his sides. He cradled a glass of milk in one hand, having clearly had the same idea. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Cora whispered, suddenly aware of her own dishabille. Her night braid hung over one shoulder, auburn strands escaping in wisps around her face. The wrapper, while modest, felt inadequate in his presence. "You didn't." He gestured with the glass, the milk catching moonlight like liquid pearl. "Sometimes the mind won't quiet, and warm milk helps." His gaze dropped briefly to the bread in her hands. "Hungry tonight?" "Not much appetite at supper," she admitted. Ephraim set down his glass and moved to the stove with practiced efficiency. "Let me warm some for you, too. And there's honey if you'd like it for the bread." He glanced over his shoulder as he worked. "Seemed like something troubled you at supper." Cora watched him pour milk into a small saucepan, his movements graceful despite his fatigue. The candlelight turned his profile to bronze, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the slight bruising beneath his eyes that spoke of his own sleeplessness. The kitchen grew warmer as he worked, though cold air still crept along the floor where she stood barefoot. The quiet darkness seemed to call for more honesty. "But it wasn't their gossip that kept me from eating." Ephraim paused, the wooden spoon stilling in his hand. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "No." Cora set the bread on the table, the coolness of the wooden surface seeping through her nightgown where she leaned against it. She focused on the feeling, letting the distraction strengthen her resolve. "I've been thinking," she began, then stopped. How did one broach such a subject? When did this practical arrangement begin to feel like something more? When did your nearness start affecting me so? Her thoughts didn't escape her lips. About the commission, Ephraim prompted, though something in his tone suggested he knew her thoughts had traveled elsewhere. About many things, she murmured. The milk began to steam, filling the air with its warm, comforting scent. Ephraim removed it from the stove, pouring carefully into 2 cups. He added a spoonful of honey to each. The amber streams caught the light as they spiraled into the milk. He carried the cups to the table, setting one before her before taking the chair opposite. The wooden seat creaked slightly under his weight as he settled. In the candle's glow, his eyes appeared darker, more intense. "Such as?" he asked gently. She watched him wrap his hands around his cup, large hands that created delicate furniture, hands that had almost caressed her face today. "Hands that I wanted to caress my face today," Cora admitted to herself. "I think I may have feelings for my husband." What if the care she felt from him was only wishful thinking on her part? She sipped her milk, buying time. The sweetness coated her tongue, warming her from within. "I've been wondering," she said slowly, "if what we agreed to—" She paused, then began again. "That is, if it still serves us both as intended." His hands tightened visibly around the cup. "Are you dissatisfied with the arrangement?" "No," she responded quickly, then caught herself. "Yes, perhaps." She set down her cup more firmly than necessary. "I don't know anymore." His expression remained carefully neutral, though she noticed the slight hitch in his breathing. "I see. These past days—" She broke off a piece of bread, crumbling it between her fingers rather than eating it. The rough texture grounded her as she searched for words. "The boundaries seemed clear when we began. A business arrangement, mutual benefit. But now—" "Yes?" His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I find the boundaries less distinct." Her confession hung in the moonlit air between them. Ephraim went absolutely still. Something flickered in his eye. Was it surprise? Or perhaps hope? It was gone before she could fully decipher it. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I apologize if I've overstepped, if my behavior has suggested anything improper." "No," Cora interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "You've been nothing but respectful. It's my own thoughts that—" She fell silent, struggling with propriety. How did a woman admit to feelings she'd never expected? Feelings that still weren't fully clear? "Cora," Ephraim said softly, and something in his tone made her look up. His blue eyes met hers directly, holding an intensity that made her breath catch. "If the arrangement has become uncomfortable for you, we can revisit the terms. I want you to feel secure here, not constrained by an agreement made in different circumstances." The gentle understanding in his words nearly undid her. He was offering her an escape, assuming her discomfort arose from his presence rather than her growing attachment to it. "That's just it," she whispered. "I don't feel constrained. I feel—" She searched for the right word, one that wouldn't betray too much. "Unsettled, as though the ground has shifted beneath my feet." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And where do you find yourself standing now?" The directness of his question emboldened her slightly. "Closer to you than I anticipated," she admitted. "You've been kind, considerate, more generous than our arrangement required, and I find myself appreciating these qualities beyond mere gratitude." Ephraim's breathing had grown notably careful, measured. His knuckles showed white where he gripped the cup. "I've tried to be mindful of boundaries," he said, each word chosen deliberately. "When I brushed your cheek today, that was presumptuous." "In the workshop today," Cora said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "When you brushed the sawdust from my face." She faltered. What was it she was struggling to tell him? That she not just enjoyed, but anticipated his touch? That she thought maybe she could love him one day? That she worried first that he loved her, and then she worried that he didn't? Or that she was afraid he might stop if her own feelings moved too slow? Cora let out a slow breath. "I'm not entirely sure what I feel." The candle flame wavered slightly, casting dancing shadows across Ephraim's face. He released his cup, flexing his hands before clasping them on the table. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that made her heart race. "I haven't wanted to presume, Cora. When we married, I promised you partnership and respect." He looked down at his interlaced fingers. "I've been trying not to complicate our arrangement with—" He stopped himself, running a hand through his already disheveled hair, before continuing with sudden intensity. "I've been trying not to love you." Somehow his words surprised her, despite confirming her suspicions. "Love?" He stood abruptly, moving to the window where moonlight painted the winter landscape in silver and shadow. His shoulders held a visible tension as he stared out at the snow-covered garden. "I shouldn't speak of it. I gave you a practical arrangement. You deserve a man who keeps his word." Cora rose carefully, the floorboards cool beneath her bare feet, as she approached him at the window. His reflection in the glass showed conflict in his profile. "Ephraim," she said softly. He turned at the sound of his name on her lips, his expression raw and unguarded in the candlelight. "These midnight hours make a man say things better left unsaid," he said roughly, though he made no move to leave. "Perhaps," Cora ventured, her own boldness surprising her, "they allow honesty that daylight conceals." He stared at her, and she saw his carefully maintained restraint warring with something else, something that set butterflies to dancing within. "What would you have me say, Cora?" An edge of desperation was in his voice. "That I've come to care for you beyond our agreement. That when I wake, my first thought is of you." His hands opened and closed at his sides. "I've been aware of you for a long time, admired you." He paused. "Always thought you deserved a good man, a better man than me." A gentle silence stretched between them before she spoke. "And then we needed each other," Cora began. Then she considered his words again and frowned. "And I'll thank you not to insult my husband." Her voice softened. "I'd wager he is the only man I would agree to marry." Her words drew him nearer to her. "Cora," his own voice was soft now, "I always kept my heart in check when I thought of you. Made sure our paths didn't cross too often. Made sure to mind my boundaries. That day you agreed to be my wife, every wall I built shattered." A loud crash from down the hall startled them both, and then Ephraim was rushing for Margaret's room, while Cora followed close behind, her bare feet silent on the chill of the floor. They found her on the floor beside her bed, the water pitcher she'd apparently been reaching for shattered around her. Her nightgown was soaked, and in the dim light from their candle, Cora could see she was shivering. "Grandmother!" Ephraim was beside her instantly, assessing for injury, even as he helped her sit up. "Where are you hurt?" "Everywhere, unfortunately," Margaret replied with attempted levity that couldn't mask the pain in her voice. "Foolish old woman thinking I could manage alone." "You're not alone," Cora said firmly, kneeling to help. "Ephraim, fetch a blanket. I'll get her nightclothes." They worked together with efficient coordination. Ephraim cleaned up spilled water and the shattered pitcher, Cora settling Margaret back in bed with dry garments and warm covers. As Cora smoothed the quilts, she felt the older woman's sharp gaze on her face. "Should have called for you when I heard the murmur of voices." Her voice was faint, but a smile played about her lips despite her exhaustion. "Found your way to the kitchen, did you?" Margaret observed, her eyes moving between them with shrewd perception. "I couldn't sleep," Cora replied, a faint blush creeping into her cheeks. "Nor could Ephraim, apparently." Margaret smiled. "He never could rest when his mind was troubled. Takes after his grandfather that way." Ephraim returned with wood for the brazier, avoiding meeting either woman's gaze. As he coaxed the fire to life, Margaret continued speaking with apparent innocence. "You know, I had terrible insomnia the night before my wedding." Her voice grew dreamy at the memory. "And there were many sleepless nights afterward. Night has a way of coaxing revelations from our hearts." She smiled at Cora's startled expression. "Grandmother," Ephraim warned softly, straightening from the now crackling fire. "Oh, hush, boy," Margaret waved dismissively. "I'm not pushing the two of you." Her expression grew gentler as she looked between them. "Just supporting what I see in those glances the two of you steal at one another." Cora watched Ephraim smile down at his grandmother, a look of love on his face. She felt some of the worry deep inside beginning to fade. It wasn't so much Margaret's evident approval that warmed her. The woman had welcomed her from the beginning, and so had Ephraim, Sarah, Margaret. Both had seemed so certain that love would blossom once she'd married. It didn't matter how they'd known. "I can trust this man." The thought was sure and solid. "I can trust what my own eyes are telling me." Cora stood slowly, smoothing her wrapper. "Do you need anything else, Margaret?" "Just rest," the older woman replied, drowsy from warmth and exertion. Her eyes fluttered closed, and in only moments her breathing evened out into sleep. Ephraim opened the bedroom door for Cora, his face shadowed in the dim light. They descended the stairs in silence, the ghost of their interrupted confession hovering between them. Back in the kitchen, their abandoned cups of milk sat cooling on the table, the candle burning lower. Cora hesitated at the threshold, uncertain whether the gentle spell of their midnight interlude was broken. "I should let you rest," Ephraim said, though he made no move toward the stairs to his own room. His gaze lingered on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Ephraim," Cora said softly, then paused, unsure of how to continue. "Yes?" Ephraim waited patiently for her to continue. "What you confessed before about trying not to love me." She looked down at her clasped hands. "I believe our marriage has found a path neither of us intended." When she looked up, Ephraim had crossed the distance between them without her noticing. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the clean scent of soap that always clung to him. "What path would that be?" His voice had dropped to a rough, intimate register that sent shivers of anticipation through her. "One that includes—" She swallowed, gathering courage. "One that includes wanting, caring, perhaps even—" "Love?" His interruption hung between them, spoken so softly she might have imagined it, but the sudden tension in his shoulders, the way his pupils darkened in the candlelight, told her she hadn't. "Is that something you would welcome?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ephraim raised his hand slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished. When she remained still, he cupped her face with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "I failed at not loving you, Cora." His voice rough, yet impossibly gentle. His thumb traced her cheekbone. Every day made it more impossible. "Ephraim," Cora breathed his name, her hand rising to cover his. "I don't know rightly what my feelings for you mean, but I know I want to explore them." The moment stretched. Cora could hear her heart beating in her ears. Ephraim's gaze met hers, dropping to her lips briefly before meeting hers once again. She could see a question in those eyes. Instinctively, Cora rose slightly on her toes, tilting her face toward his. This kiss was nothing like the brief peck at their wedding. This was slow, tentative. His lips moved against hers with a sweetness that made her sigh, her free hand finding its way to his shoulder. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. "We should discuss this properly," Ephraim murmured, though he didn't step away. His lips still hovered near hers. "In daylight, with clear heads." "Probably," Cora agreed, though her fingers traced the edge of his collar where it lay open. Ephraim nodded slowly, the hand that still cradled her cheek turning to capture her own hand, bringing it to his lips for a gentle kiss. She shivered. They stood there together, both reluctant to part, his thumb tracing gentle, absent circles on her palm. Finally, he released her hand and stepped back. "I'll bank the fire." Cora extinguished the candle, pitching the kitchen into moonlit shadows. She waited by the stairs as Ephraim secured the house for the night. They climbed the stairs together, their steps quiet on the worn wood. Cora reached for her bedroom door, pausing with her hand on the latch when Ephraim called her name. She turned back to find him watching her with an expression so tender it stole her breath. "Thank you." "For what?" He seemed to search for words. "For becoming my wife." Chapter 12. Ephraim pushed open the door with a deep, satisfied breath, noticing an enticing scent that surely meant Sarah had dropped off one of her pies. He paused when he saw his wife, a contented smile emerging. She sat with her father's rag rug spread across her lap, sunlight turning her auburn hair to copper. 3 weeks. That's all they'd been married, yet finding her here felt as natural as breathing. When had that happened? When had this house become home, not just because Margaret was here, but because Cora was too? "I should ask her to the church social," he thought absently, just as he had when Pastor Thomas mentioned it this morning when he ran into him. He tossed his hat aside, and it landed with a soft thump. "How was your delivery?" Cora's head didn't lift from her work. "Melba loved it," he said, moving into the parlor. "Said she can't wait to show it off to the sewing circle." "Did she really?" Now Cora did look up, her dark eyes finding his face. "Did she like the fabric?" "Called it inspired. Said she'd never seen a color that brought oak to life like that blue wool did." "I was worried the blue might be too bold against the grain," Cora admitted, setting her work aside. "It's not what most would choose for oak." He smiled at her with tender pride, stepping closer, to catch a copper curl that had escaped her pins. The strand felt like silk between his fingers as he wound it gently around one fingertip. What would it be like to remove the pins entirely and slide his fingers freely through her hair? The thought would surely distract him, drawing out a conversation that had already delivered most of the information he had intended to share before heading back to the shop. "Asked if you might consider consulting on her next commission," he said, and watched the color bloom in her cheeks over the recognition of her work. "Beautiful," he thought, something warm unfurling in his chest. "I love you, sweetheart." He did not say the words aloud. Gently, reluctantly, he let the curl slide from his finger. She stood to face him properly. "She really said that?" He smiled down at her. "Of course. Why wouldn't she be pleased? My wife is a talented woman." He emphasized the playful smugness in his tone, as if he were crediting himself with her very existence. He was pleased when she giggled, when her eyes darted to meet his. Ephraim held her gaze and slowly began to dip his head. He didn't ask permission, just watched, moving slow, giving her time to refuse, giving himself time to notice any hesitation. There was none. His kisses were feather-light, first one eye, then the other, and then he took her lips in a slow, tender kiss that left them both breathless. He lay his forehead against hers, looked at her lashes against her cheek, waited first one heartbeat, then two, and then she was gazing into his eyes. He let the moment stretch between them before pulling back and pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Still haven't asked her to the social. I should do it now. Arrange some pleasant public courtship so I can stop rushing my wife. There's more, he said instead, reaching out to capture her hand once more. The banker's wife was visiting when I arrived. She was quite taken with your work too. He hadn't intended to mention the banker's wife until he had spoken with the banker for himself. Made sure the man wasn't going to be swept up into Holloway's contempt of him. More commissions. Her voice still wasn't quite steady. Hearing it, his chest tightened. I love that you let me love you, he thought, that you want my touch. His wife made both things clear that night in the kitchen, just as she made clear she craved time to understand her feelings. Mrs. Cora Burke. His voice was playful with exaggerated formality. May I have your permission to court my wife? The words startled a giggle from her. You realize that's rather backwards, Mr. Burke? Completely, he agreed, thumb tracing her cheekbone. But I find myself wanting to... A harsh coughing erupted from Margaret's room, breaking into the moment. The sound sent both of them running as the coughing continued, wet and desperate. Margaret sat propped against her pillows, her face flushed with fever as she struggled for breath between coughs. Her nightcap had slipped askew, revealing silver hair damp with perspiration. It was terrifying to hear her struggle for breath. Number, not yet, not now. It was a silent plea. Help her, Lord. I'm not ready to lose her. Grandmother. He moved to support her back as another fit seized her. Over her head, he met Cora's gaze, seeing a worry there that matched his own. When did this start? He asked, looking back at his grandmother. Just now, she wheezed between coughs. Was sleeping peacefully then. Another fit seized her. Cora's hand pressed against Margaret's forehead. She's burning up. Her voice remained steady despite undercurrents of worry. I'll fetch tea and cool cloths, Cora said, already turning toward the door, and honey for her throat. Camphor oil is on the kitchen shelf, Ephraim called after her, adjusting the pillows to help Margaret sit more upright. Middle cabinet, blue bottle. He focused on soothing his grandmother, murmuring reassurances as he straightened her nightcap and smoothed back damp silver strands. Her hand clutched his with fragile strength. Cora returned with cloths, quickly wetting and wringing them out before passing them to Ephraim. The kettle's heating now. How is her breathing? Has the coughing eased at all? I'll be back with tea soon. He felt her behind him then, hands resting gently on his shoulders, her lips brushing his cheek. He savored the moment of sweet comfort it brought him as he bathed his grandmother's face and hands. His wife returned not long after, a tray laden with sickbed supplies in her hands. The pungent medicinal scent of camphor oil arrived with her, sharp and astringent. A small stack of handkerchiefs lay ready for another coughing spell. I've the tea prepared, she said, voice soft as she set the tray down and assessed Margaret's condition. Is she resting now? Cora placed her hand against Margaret's forehead, then cheeks. He looked at his grandmother before turning his attention back to his wife. Seems to be breathing a bit easier. His eyes searched her face for a moment, throat tightening as he made a decision. I'm going to fetch Dr. Franklin. Of course, Ephraim. Cora moved to his side, already preparing to take his place. We'll be fine. I've some camphor cloth ready if she wakes with another coughing fit, and I'll try to get some tea into her while you're gone. He reached out for Cora's hand, bringing her palm to his lips, watching a sweet flush climb into her cheeks. Thank you, sweetheart. When he returned with the doctor, he found Cora singing softly to Margaret, a cool cloth on her forehead, the room smelling strongly of camphor and willow bark. "It's a cold, as you expected," the doctor pronounced a short while later, complicated by her condition, of course. He fastened shut his bag. "You're handling her care just right, Ephraim." The doctor's voice was quiet, and Ephraim turned to him. "Wish I could offer you better comfort, but for now there's no reason to believe she won't pull through." Ephraim nodded, and Cora came into the room. "Would you like some tea or coffee, perhaps, doctor?" she asked, seeing he was preparing to leave. "No need," he replied. "Is there anything special I need consider for Margaret?" Cora asked the doctor. "You're a fine nurse, my dear. Just continue as you are. Ephraim is a lucky man." He turned back for one last instruction. "I don't expect you to need to, but if she doesn't show signs of improvement or takes a turn for the worse, come for me again." At Ephraim's nod, he took his leave. There were more patients to tend to. Cora and Ephraim returned to their own tending, nursing Margaret through the long night, with one occasionally fussing at the other to go rest or to grab a bite to eat. Neither complied. It was nearly dawn when they felt the crisis had truly passed, leaving them both exhausted. "She's resting better," Cora observed softly. Ephraim studied his grandmother's face, gratitude overwhelming him. "Come," he said, rising and offering his hand. "Let's give her some quiet." He led her to the small settee outside Margaret's door, close enough to hear distress, far enough for private conversation. When they sat, his arm found its natural place around her shoulders, drawing her close. She snuggled against him as if they'd done this countless times, her head fitting perfectly in the hollow where his shoulder met chest. He felt the stress of the day finally begin to ease. "This feels right," he thought, thumb tracing gentle patterns on her arm. Like coming home after wandering lost. The house settled around them, old wood cooling with familiar sounds. Margaret's steady breathing through the partly open door marked time like a gentle metronome. "Ephraim," Cora murmured into his chest, "shall we go to the church social on Saturday?" There was a hint of a laugh in her voice. He dropped a gentle kiss on her hair and gave a moment of consideration to those pins. He began to remove them gently, one by one. "Sarah," he guessed softly, "I thought I smelled her pie when I came home today." His hands continued moving through her hair, now finally freed from the pins, silky strands sifting through his fingers. He felt more than heard her soft chuckle. "She said you ran into the pastor this morning." He lightly massaged her head before settling into slow, soothing strokes. Her wordless sound of pleasure at his touch was so soft he barely heard it, like the purr of a contented kitten. "This courting business," she murmured drowsily, "I find I rather like it." A smile tugged at his lips. "So does your husband." They sat in comfortable silence then, Margaret's steady breathing becoming a gentle rhythm that lulled them both. Cora shifted closer, her hand coming to rest over his heart. Could she feel how it quickened at her touch? He pressed another kiss to her hair, breathing in soap and lavender and home. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered, though her slow, even breathing told him she was already asleep. He drifted into sleep himself then, briefly aware of the distant birdsong, a tiny smile curving his lips as the night broke into day. Chapter 13. Ephraim watched, filled with quiet contentment, as Cora poured coffee into Margaret's cup. His grandmother's color had improved considerably in the days since her illness, and this morning she seemed particularly bright-eyed as she observed them. "More biscuits, Ephraim?" Cora offered the basket, her smile warming him more than the coffee ever could. "Thank you, sweetheart." He accepted the basket, his fingers brushing hers in a touch that lingered. He found himself captivated by the faint blush colored her cheeks. Margaret's soft chuckle drew his attention. "You two," she said, shaking her head with evident pleasure, "reminds me of Frederick and myself, all those years ago." "Does it?" Cora asked, happy to indulge her, despite the many times she had expressed a similar sentiment. "Oh my, yes." Margaret's eyes took on a distant look, gazing beyond them into memory. "Frederick used to sit right where you are, Ephraim, every morning for 40 years, reading the newspaper while I poured his coffee." She smiled at some private recollection. He had this habit of folding the corners of pages with stories he thought might interest me, was always a thoughtful man, full of sweet surprises. "Grandmother," Ephraim warned gently, though he couldn't suppress his own smile. "What?" Margaret asked innocently. "Can't an old woman enjoy seeing her grandson happy?" She reached across to pat Cora's hand. "And my new granddaughter, too." Ephraim watched his wife's expression soften. He smiled. "I have something to show you after breakfast," he told Cora, striving for a bland tone. Her eyebrows rose in question. "Oh." "A surprise," he replied, enjoying the curiosity that danced across her features. His hand reached for his coffee. "Is it in your workshop?" his grandmother asked with exaggerated, wide-eyed innocence. Ephraim spluttered, choking on the healthy swig of coffee he'd just taken. He had, of course, informed his grandmother of the nature of this surprise before beginning. Cora dissolved into giggles, watching him as he caught his breath. He grinned over at her before shaking his head at his grandmother, giving her a loving smile in return for her unrepentant grin. They finished breakfast joyfully, Margaret recounting stories of Ephraim's childhood that made Cora laugh and him feign embarrassment. When dishes were cleared, he took Cora's hand. "Come with me." He led her through the house to the back room he'd been working on secretly for the past 3 days. At the closed door, he paused. "Close your eyes." Cora complied, a small smile playing at her lips. Ephraim opened the door, guiding her forward with a gentle hand at the small of her back. The scent of fresh-cut wood and linseed oil filled the space. "You can look now," he said softly. Cora opened her eyes, and the small gasp that escaped her made all his late-night work worthwhile. His grandfather's study had been transformed into a proper workshop, her workshop. Along one wall, he'd built floor-to-ceiling shelving units with labeled compartments for her salvaged treasures. A sturdy work table stood in the center, its surface sanded smooth and oiled to a gentle luster. Shelves above held jars of buttons, spools of thread, and other notions. A restored treadle sewing machine, one he'd found abandoned in a client's barn and refurbished in secret, occupied one corner. "Ephraim," Cora whispered, turning slowly to take it all in. "You needed a proper space," he said simply, "for the restoration work, something more suitable than the corner of my workshop downtown." He watched her face carefully. "Do you like it?" Cora moved to the work table, running her fingers reverently over its surface. "Like it?" She turned to him with bright eyes. "It's perfect. When did you even find the time?" "After you'd retire for the evening." He stepped closer. "I wanted to surprise you." "Well, you've succeeded," she said, voice thick with emotion. She gestured to the sewing machine. "And this? How did you—" "Had it in my workshop, been restoring it bit by bit." He shrugged, as if it were nothing, though they both knew it represented hours of meticulous work. "Thought you could use it for the upholstery projects." Cora's hands pressed to her heart, and for a moment Ephraim worried she might cry. Instead, she closed the distance between them, rising on tiptoe to press a kiss to his cheek that lingered. "Thank you," she whispered against his skin. He wanted to turn his head, to capture her lips with his own, but he restrained himself. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice rougher than intended. Clearing his throat, he stepped back slightly. "I should get to the shop. The Evans order needs finishing by week's end." "Of course," Cora nodded, though a flicker of disappointment crossed her features. "Will you be home for dinner?" "I'll try," he promised. "Might run late if the banker wants to discuss that new commission." "The banker's wife was quite interested in our pieces," Cora reminded him, and the simple pronoun, "our," filled him with satisfaction. Margaret appeared in the doorway, leaning on her cane. "My, what a lovely workroom," she observed. "You've outdone yourself, Ephraim." "Cora deserves a proper space," he replied, catching his wife's gaze with a warmth that made her look away, cheeks coloring. Margaret's knowing smile told him she missed nothing. "Indeed she does. Now off with you. You've commissions waiting, and I need to show Cora where I've hidden my best embroidery threads all these years." With a final glance at his wife, still surveying her new workshop with wonder, Ephraim collected his coat and hat. The early December air bit sharp when he stepped outside, but he barely felt the cold. Cora's expression of delight had warmed him thoroughly from within. Main Street bustled with midday activity as Ephraim finished loading the completed rocking chair onto Mr. Peterson's wagon. The elderly farmer thanked him, pressing payment into his hand before climbing laboriously onto the seat. "The missus will be pleased," Peterson said, gathering the reins. "Been wanting one of your chairs for years." "Hope she enjoys it," Ephraim replied, pocketing the coins. "Good day to you." As Peterson's wagon pulled away, Ephraim's gaze drifted across the street to where the First Bank of Oak Ridge stood, its stone facade gleaming in the winter sunlight. He had to admit he didn't care much if he received the commission Holloway had mentioned, not if the bank manager was foolish enough to be persuaded by gossip, not if he was of Holloway's ilk. But Cora was excited about the possibility of a commission from the man's wife. What was her name? How had Melba introduced her? Mrs. Reynolds. Jane Reynolds, he remembered, said her husband Albert was the bank manager. His thoughts drifted toward home. "I should go home early," he thought, still gazing over at the bank. He noticed two figures ascending the steps, Victor Holloway and Albert Reynolds, the bank manager. They paused at the entrance, exchanging words Ephraim couldn't hear. Then, to his surprise, both men turned and walked back down the steps, heading toward the Oak Barrel Saloon. Ephraim hesitated. He'd promised Cora to speak with Reynolds about the commission, and this might be his best opportunity. He had no pressing tasks left at the shop. It would likely set the gossips wagging. But Reynolds was a busy man, and his own time with what remained of the day was better spent at home, with his wife. Besides, Reynolds was with Holloway at the moment. What better way to read the man's influence on the banker? Before he could reconsider, Ephraim found himself crossing the street. Just a quick business conversation, he told himself, in and out. No harm in that. The heavy wooden door of the oak barrel creaked as he pushed it open. Smoke hung in lazy curls beneath the tin ceiling. The low murmur of voices was punctuated by occasional laughter, the soft clink of glasses, the scrape of chairs against wooden floors, each sound an invitation, and beneath it all, the faint but unmistakable burn of greed, sweat and desperation all swirling in the air. One moment he knew he could so easily become the man he was before. In the next, he knew that he wouldn't. But it surprised him, that pull. Somehow he hadn't expected to feel it. Then came shame. Shame for feeling even the slightest kinship with who he'd once been. Shame that he could still taste temptation. Had he thought himself above it all, Wry amusement at his own pride filled him, and he shook his head. "Well, if it isn't Burke," Victor's smooth voice cut through the noise. He sat alone at a corner table, a glass of amber liquid before him. No sign of Reynolds. "Come over, man. Sit." "Only a fool accepts shame the Lord's already forgiven," he thought, eyeing Holloway. "Where's the bank manager?" He walked over. He did not sit at the table. "He stepped away," Victor replied with a casual wave. "He'll return shortly." His gaze was too keen, too calculating. "Join me for a drink while you wait." "I don't drink anymore," he said. "Just needed a word with Reynolds about a commission." "Ah, yes, the reformed carpenter." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Quite the story. The prodigal son returns, builds a respectable business, even secures a wife." He gestured to the chair opposite. "At least sit, Burke. Standing there makes you look like a schoolboy awaiting punishment." He smirked when Ephraim made no move to join him. "Whiskey's the finest they've ever stocked," Victor observed, lifting his glass so the liquid caught the light. A waft of its aroma reached Ephraim, but he didn't react. "As I said, I don't drink." Ephraim could feel a headache forming. This is a waste of time, he thought. Victor shrugged, setting down his glass with a soft clink. His fingers dipped into his waistcoat pocket, emerging with a deck of cards. "Perhaps a friendly game while we wait," Victor suggested, beginning to shuffle with practiced ease. The soft whisper of card against card filled the air. "No stakes necessary," Victor said, "just to pass the time." "No," he said. He stood to leave. "Came to talk to Reynolds, not play games. I'll find him later." Victor's eyebrows rose slightly as he continued to shuffle. "Come now, Burke. Surely a man with your experience can handle a simple game of cards without falling back into old ways." Ephraim began to walk away. "Tell him," he froze. That voice inside wasn't his own. He wanted to keep going, but uncertainty filled him, hostility and contempt. It had been a long time since he'd offered anything else to Victor Holloway. He didn't think he'd ever offered him friendship. Pastor Thomas liked to say, the only friendship the church owed sinners was the friendship Jesus offered on the cross. Most took it as permission to be snide and self-righteous. "Unless, of course," Victor continued, "you'd prefer to make a wager." Ephraim could hear the flick of the cards as Victor dealt two hands. The offer of a bet kindled anger rather than temptation. "Number can't be sure that was the Lord's voice, and not some fool thought of my own." He took another step. "You killed one temptation today. It would be a shame to lose a wager to another." There was humor in that voice. It took the anger clean out of him. He was sure the amusement that filled him was not entirely his own. So he folded. "You win, Lord." He turned back. The chair scraped as he pulled it back from the table. "Cards are dealt," Victor said smoothly. The look on his face said he counted it his win, that he'd brought Burke to the table, but the smug glint evaporated when he saw the other man's face. A flicker Ephraim had no time to decipher crossed Holloway's face before it was replaced with a look of pure malice that had his hackles rising before Holloway spoke a word. "I've the perfect wager. You win, and I'll grant you and your wife a commission. I'm sure I would be most pleased with the work she does with those exquisite hands." The mockery was clear in his voice, and his smile grew wide and ugly when Ephraim shoved the chair back from the table, face already white with anger. The saloon was filled with the strangest wave of silence he had ever heard, as those near their table fell silent and whispered to their curious neighbors, and on it went in turn. He knew all eyes were on them now. He didn't care, but Victor Holloway wasn't finished. "I win, and you grant me a touch of time," From your wife. I'm sure she'd be quite satisfied working in my home." Rage swept through Ephraim, and he held himself perfectly still. Cora's face appeared in his mind. Then Margaret's, the workshop he'd built with his own hands, the rocking chair waiting for its final coat of varnish. Sunday mornings at church, head clear and conscience clean. The Lord had not sent him back to this table to vent his rage on the man, however much he deserved it. But he'd say his own piece before he gave the word he figured the Lord wanted him to give. His voice was tightly controlled when he spoke, and he made sure his voice carried. "I'd like to wipe the floor with you for the insult you just gave my wife, and Holloway." Ephraim paused, staring the other man in the eye as the moment stretched. "We both know I could do it." He saw the man's face redden with anger as chuckles sputtered around the room. Ephraim ignored them, just glared into Holloway's eyes until the other man looked away. The anger was still hard in his voice when he continued, "I know your game, Holloway. You saw me in here and thought you could goad me to drink, to gamble. I take the bait, I get dragged through the mud, my wife and grandmother along with me. I refuse. You do your worst to make me look weak." His gaze flicked around the room, pausing when he spotted Reynolds. How long had the man been here? He dismissed the thought and looked back at the man in front of him. "It's a fool's play, Holloway, but I don't think anyone here is fool enough to fall for it. Don't rightly care if they are." He took a careful breath. "Time for your peace now, Lord. You want me to make your mark, better let me borrow your aim." He'd repent for the tone of that prayer later, even if deep down he was certain the Lord wasn't offended. He'd walked the edge too close today to take the gamble. When Ephraim spoke again, he made an effort to soften his anger, to let his words bring the weight of the moment with them. For a moment, he gazed at the cards on the table. "Won't say I wasn't tempted," he admitted, forcing his eyes away from the cards. His voice shook slightly, but grew stronger with each word. "These cards, this place, they call to something I've fought hard to silence. Fooled myself, too, into thinking the call wasn't so easy to hear anymore." Ephraim thought of the woman then. He'd never met her. Couldn't remember if he'd ever even seen her. He looked Victor Holloway dead in the eye. "My wife isn't some trophy for you to win. She's not a toy for your pleasure." His voice was hard again, cold. The words he gave next surprised him, though not so much because of what he said, but because his voice softened with a gentleness he couldn't control. He knew instinctively these words wouldn't reach the ears beyond this table. "Neither was the woman you chased away." He thought he saw something shatter in the other man's eyes. And then the saloon door burst open with a bang, cold air rushing in. Cora stood there, shawl askew as if she'd run, her eyes wide as they found him. "Ephraim!" His name was a single cry from her lips. Behind her, Ephraim could see a gaggle of town gossips had followed her into the saloon. Chapter 14. Cora turned the worn page of the leather-bound volume, her voice low and steady as she read to Margaret. The older woman's bedroom held the lingering scent of dried lavender that hung in so small sachets from the bedposts. "The lilies of the field toil not, neither do they spin," Cora read, the familiar scripture rolling easily from her tongue. "Yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these." That was always one of my favorite verses as a girl. Used to believe I'd run around in a dress made of flower petals in heaven. The older woman sat propped against pillows, embroidered with her own hand decades earlier, a crocheted shawl about her shoulders despite the warmth of the brazier that Ephraim had carefully stoked before leaving for his shop that morning. "You called me grandmother this morning," Margaret continued, "when you brought my tea, quite naturally too." Had she? Cora felt warmth creep into her cheeks. "I suppose it's because you've welcomed me so generously from the beginning." Margaret's eyes twinkled with satisfaction as she reached to pat Cora's hand, her silver thimble still on her finger, though she hadn't the strength for sewing yet. The simple touch filled Cora with unexpected emotion. How strange that after years of being just herself and father against the world, she now had this: a grandmother who delighted in her presence, a husband who looked at her with tenderness, a home where she belonged. "I'm glad of it," Cora admitted, squeezing Margaret's frail fingers gently. "More than I can say." They finished the morning reading, and Cora helped Margaret settle for her customary nap, adjusting the patchwork quilt that had been handed down through 3 generations of Burkes. "You rest now," she whispered, checking that the water glass and bell were within reach on the bedside table. "I'll be in the workshop if you need anything." Workshop. The word sent a thrill through her. She made her way downstairs and through the house to the room Ephraim had unveiled just that morning before heading to his shop. Cora stood in the threshold, breathing in the mingled scents of fresh-cut wood, linseed oil, and the faint metallic tang of salvaged treasures. She could scarcely believe the transformation from the cluttered storage room of yesterday. Her fingers traced the edge of the work table, sanded satin smooth, exactly the right height for her to work without stooping. She noted the small drawer built into the right side, perfectly sized for her measuring tape and scissors. Ephraim had even carved a small notch at the front edge, the perfect spot to rest her teacup while working. The shelves he'd built held her collection of buttons, fabric scraps, and salvaged findings, each in its proper place. But it was the organization that caught her breath, not alphabetical or by size as anyone might arrange things, but by potential use, exactly as she'd organized her father's collection in their small cabin. How had Ephraim known? He must have carefully observed her own methods during their work together. Cora moved to the corner where the restored treadle sewing machine gleamed. Her hand caressed its scrolled iron base, fingertips following the curve of the wheel. Her father had always promised to find her one someday. How many hours had Ephraim spent restoring this for her? How many nights after she'd retired to bed had he labored in secret to create this space? She sat on the small stool, feet finding the treadle as her hands smoothed over the polished wood surface. The decorative tin box beside the machine contained needles of various sizes, arranged exactly as she preferred them. A small cushion, one Margaret had showed her that first night, fondly sharing the memory of the day she'd made it, had been repurposed as a pincushion, placed within easy reach. "I love him," she whispered to the empty room, the words hanging in the stillness. Not gratitude, though she felt that too, not practical appreciation for security offered, not even simply caring affection. Love. The revelation left her momentarily dizzy. When had it happened? Perhaps it had been blooming since that first slow smile he gave her when she accepted his proposal. Or had it been the night he'd first said he loved her, a declaration he'd struggled to stifle? Cora pressed a hand to her stays, feeling her heart pounding beneath the layers of clothing. She needed to tell him, to show him somehow. But how? What gesture could possibly convey the depth of what she felt? Her gaze swept the workshop and she spotted a scrap of fine blue wool, the very fabric they'd used for the milliner's sewing table. Perhaps a new tool belt to replace his worn one. He'd mentioned just yesterday that the leather was cracking. That was it. She would need leather for the belt and perhaps brass fittings to match the ones on his good Sunday boots. Nothing in her salvage collection was fine enough for this purpose. She would need to visit Henderson's store. Margaret would sleep another hour, at least. There was time to walk to the store and back before she woke. "I'll just leave a note in case she wakes early," Cora thought to herself. She changed quickly into her second-best dress, dark blue wool with neat cuffs she'd embellished with salvaged lace, and pinned her hair more carefully. She fastened her mother's cross, smiling as she took it from the box where it still lay, the box Ephraim had given her on their wedding day. A wave of tenderness washed through her as she remembered his gentle promise to help her repair her childhood home. Even the care he'd shown her before proposing. How could he have shown her his love so thoroughly in such a short time? Winter's bite greeted her as she stepped outside, the December air sharp against her cheeks. She tucked her shawl closer. Main Street bustled with midday activity, women darting between errands, a wagon laden with lumber rattling past, children racing from the schoolhouse. Cora nodded politely to Mrs. Peterson, who returned the gesture with a surprised raise of eyebrows. The bell above Henderson's door jangled as she entered. Warmth and the mingled scents of spices, coffee, and dry goods enveloped her. Cora moved directly to the fabric and notion section, fingers sifting through leather scraps. Too thin, too rough, too damaged. None were worthy of the gift she envisioned. "Mr. Henderson," she called softly to the proprietor, "have you any good saddle leather? I need something substantial for a tool belt." Before he could answer, a fragment of conversation reached her from the next aisle, where Mrs. Henderson and her daughters huddled together, examining calico. "Burke going into the saloon earlier today." The words, deliberately pitched to Carrie, froze Cora's hand mid-reach. "Well, once a gambler," the elder Mrs. Henderson said, satisfaction evident in her tone. "Always inclined to backslide, as the good book tells us." Cora's basket slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, striking the wooden floor with a hollow thud. The leather pieces scattered across the worn planks. The conversation immediately ceased. None of that mattered. Her heart was beating frantically. Ephraim was in trouble. There was simply no other explanation. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the end of the aisle, false concern painting her features beneath an elaborate hat festooned with dyed feathers. "Are you quite all right, Mrs. Burke?" Cora stared blankly at those feathers a moment. Then, without a word, she turned and ran. Some part of her mind was aware that a crowd of women had gathered behind her, but she paid them no heed. Nor did she give a thought to the basket she'd left scattered over the floor at Henderson's store. Cora paused outside the saloon's weathered door, heart pounding in her ears. The faded paint, the small window obscured by grime, the worn threshold, all marked territory where ladies didn't tread. Respectable women waited outside or sent men to retrieve their husbands. She didn't care. Her husband needed her. She took a deep breath, straightened her shawl with fingers that barely obeyed her, and pushed the door open with more force than intended. It banged against the wall, the sound like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. The thick haze of tobacco smoke stung her eyes immediately. The sharp odors of whiskey, sweat, and stale beer assaulted her senses. Every eye turned to her. Men frozen with glasses halfway to their lips. A card game interrupted mid-deal, the barkeeper pausing mid-wipe of a spotty glass. And there, across the room, Ephraim standing tall and straight beside a seated Victor Holloway. His jaw was set in that determined line she had come to know, his shoulders square and unbowed. "Ephraim!" The anguish in her cry startled her. A flurry of whispers erupted around her. "Burke's woman," someone muttered. "Never seen a lady in here," another voice added. Cora ignored them all, gathering her skirts to prevent them touching the sticky floorboards as she crossed the room. She reached him breathlessly, hands instinctively clutching his forearms, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the wool of his coat. "They said you—" She paused to catch her breath, searching his face for signs of injury. "Are you hurt? Did you—" She gave up then, worrying her bottom lip as she gazed with a face full of worry into her husband's eyes. Eyes, she realized, that were staring back at her with tender amusement. For a moment, the crowded saloon seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them in a private bubble. Ephraim's large hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I wasn't in a brawl, sweetheart." He tucked an errant strand of hair behind her ear. "Didn't drink, didn't gamble. I wouldn't risk hurting grandmother like that. Hurting you." His voice was husky. Only then did Cora become fully aware of their audience, including the Henderson ladies that had followed her, along with a few curious passerby who tagged along. She had never cared much about the town gossips. "Ephraim," she began, and then stopped, staring up at him for a moment. She frowned. Should I just tell him now, she wondered. It was going to be part of the surprise. She didn't realize she'd spoken aloud until she heard her husband's voice. "I promise you I am surprised." His tone held gentle teasing, but it was the words that startled a chuckle from her. She supposed that was true. She opened her mouth, ready to tease him that any shock she'd given him was half his fault. "I love you, Ephraim Burke," she whispered instead. The words meant only for him, despite their audience. She watched the joy lighting his eyes, and she delighted in the smile he gave her, the slow, sweet smile he'd given her the day she'd said yes, the slow, sweet smile he'd given her countless times since. It was her favorite smile. Then Ephraim's eyes flickered briefly to the watching crowd before returning to her face, a gleam of mischief suddenly dancing in his blue gaze. "Will you marry me again, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "For love this time." The question began with that playful glint, softened into such tender vulnerability that Cora felt her heart might burst. Overwhelmed, she could only nod, melting into shy delight at the love shining in his eyes. Ephraim offered his arm. "Shall we go home?" Cora slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow. Together they walked toward the door, the floorboards creaking beneath their steps. A fragment of a whisper floated behind them. "Land sakes, it's like something out of a newspaper novel." Cora felt a giggle rise in her throat as they stepped out into the cold afternoon air. Gossips will be gossips, no matter the tale, she thought. With that slow smile that made her heart skip, Ephraim leaned down to press a kiss to her forehead. They walked home arm in arm, leaving the gossips and the saloon far behind them.